The ocean doesn't whisper. It waits. You descend through the weight of it, now past the rippling surface, where sunlight still pretends to matter, through the thermoclines that throb with changing pressure, down into the velvet dark where light has never been. And down here, where machines warp and human lungs would collapse in seconds, something stirs. Not once, not loudly, just sometimes. A sonar pulse that comes back wrong. A cable crushed from within. A glint of reflected light that disappears when you zoom in. And a shape, always the shape too large, too still, too patient to be called alive, but too deliberate to be called dead. You're not watching a horror film. There's no orchestral swell, no slow pan into tentacled ruin. These are facts, or at least things recorded by machines logged time-stamped, then quietly moved into folders labeled low confidence or anomalous non-repeatables. It's always the same, a silence too perfect, a blur too smooth, a mass too symmetrical for rock, and too big for anything in the taxonomy. A sonar dome picks up a pulse so regular it seems like breathing. An ROV catches a flicker of movement, not a creature, just the edge of something vast, then cuts to black. Scientists shrug, funding dries up, and the ocean resumes its old trick, hiding in plain sight. There's no single monster. No kraken, no Godzilla. This isn't mythology. It's pattern, it's pressure, it's omission. Every year, dozens of autonomous vehicles are lost in trenches no one has ever swum. Hundreds of hours of footage go dark, corrupted, or non-diagnostic. Every so often, something floats to the surface. A chunk of flesh without a match. A tag warped by pressure no known animal could reach. A piece of metal etched with shapes too orderly to be coral. And every time the official reports come in, weather equipment, failure, mistaken scale, photographic error. But the data lingers. So does the fear. Ask the sub-pilots who refuse to return to certain sectors. Ask the sonar technicians who mute the speakers when the tone comes back. Ask the biologists who have seen bite marks wider than any shark and claw patterns that spiral. Ask them, and they'll tell you quietly, something is down there. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. Drop a comment below with your location and local time. I want to know how far this signal reaches and who's drifting off into the dark with me tonight. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started on tonight's journey together. You close your eyes, but you're still sinking. You hear the hum of the deep growing louder. You don't know if you're alone anymore. You were never alone. You're suspended over the mid-Atlantic ridge, somewhere near the Azores, where the water hangs too still for comfort, and even the currents hesitate. Your ROV drifts downward, slow and obedient, tethered by fiber optic leash and wrapped in aluminum bones. You watch its depth counter tick higher. 800 meters, 1,200, 2,400. Outside, there is only dark, not just the absence of light. This is a thick, swallowing dark that wants nothing more than for you to forget the sun ever existed. The ocean isn't empty here. It's holding its breath. Your objective is simple. Just another seismic mapping pass across the southern shelf of São Miguel, where European oceanographers hope to chart fault lines and locate new vent fields. Nothing dramatic. Just another quiet shift of tectonic crust, just more data. But the sonar ping comes back wrong. It isn't garbled. It's worse, it's clean. Too clean. The return signal bounces back faster than it should and draws a shape where there shouldn't be one. Oval, symmetrical, smooth like the top of a buried dome. At first, your instruments suggest it's sediment a bulge beneath the seabed. But that doesn't make sense. There's no uplift, no recent seismic shift, no thermal plume. You check the logs. A flat thermal bloom sits atop it, not rising, not dispersing, just faintly pulsing every 22 minutes. Not strong enough to trigger alarms, but too regular to be natural. The texts name it something forgettable. Anomaly 5/17 AZ. You write it down. You don't forget. At 3,700 meters below sea level, the ROV hovers above the dome. The camera feed flickers through the particulate haze, panning slowly. Nothing stirs. The slope is too even, the angle's too smooth. No coral, no vent scars, no crust fractures. The sediment is meters thick, untouched, as though time itself has forgotten this place. Then the pulse comes. The temperature spikes half a degree just for a second. The sonar returns, distort not wildly, just enough to suggest movement. Not from outside the dome, from within. And then nothing. No aftershock. No ripple. Just silence again. The dome remains still. Watching maybe. Or sleeping. One of the scientists back on shore later says something that sticks with you. It's like something put itself to sleep on purpose. The thought crawls into your head and refuses to leave. You start digging into old logs. In 1973, a Portuguese trawler reported compass failure in the same region. A magnetic drift, like the seafloor itself, had whispered false directions. In 2001, a NATO sub-exercise rerouted around this area. No explanation, just redirection. And in 2013, a satellite thermal scan caught a soft, blurry signature, exactly the same dimensions, same location. Still there. Still dormant. The dome never evolved, never broke down, never vanished. It just stopped pulsing. As if something inside decided to wait again. Some whisper, it's a methane cold, seep a pocket of trapped gas emitting residual heat. But those don't pulse in rhythmic intervals, and they don't bury themselves under perfectly even sediment. Others claim it's an ancient carcass, a fossilized leviathan entombed in mud, its tissues long gone, but its core still radiating the last warmth of decomposition. That sounds poetic, almost comforting, but here's the truth. No whale, no fish, no extinct marine reptile ever measured 100 meters long and 45 meters wide. And certainly not with that symmetry. A few of the more fringe researchers go further. Quiet emails passed between retired naval engineers, geologists who saw too much and said too little. They don't think it's organic or geologic. They think it's both or neither. A buried object, something designed to imitate the seabed, not a wreck, not a ruin, a remnant. You're still thinking about that when the autonomous vehicle captures a final frame just before the feed dies. A ripple across the top of the dome, concentric, even, as though the thing beneath had inhaled or sighed. The image was never released to the public, not because of what it showed, but because of what it implied, that it's not inert, it's just patient, and in the years since, no one has gone back. Funding was pulled, interest faded, but 5/17 AZ is still there, quiet, unchanged, waiting. You drift above it now in your thoughts, above a sleeping form too large to be understood and too old to be remembered. You imagine it beneath the silt, not breathing, Not living, but choosing not to move. Because sometimes the deepest parts of the ocean don't hide monsters. They are monsters, and they don't wake with violence. They wait with silence. You descend again this time, not to a sleeping dome, but into something far more immediate. You're tracking a robotic submersible ROV 327 as it slides like a silver beetle down the western slope of the Mariana Trench. There's no dramatic music, no urgent chatter in the comms, just the steady click of depth markers passing 20,000 feet, $25,000, $30,000. At these depths, sunlight is a rumor. The water is so dense it bends sound light time. Pressure here doesn't just crush, it redefines. This is the Hadal zone, the bottom of Earth's deepest gash. If the planet has a mouth, this is it. And something is moving inside. ROV 327 was never built to discover monsters. It was designed to sample microbial life near geothermal vents, slow-moving, non-aggressive science. It had articulated arms-reinforced pressure housing and a camera rig mounted inside borosilicate domes. 60 dives, no issues. A perfect record, until this one. The ROV's light cones sweep across the trench wall like tiny lighthouses. Silt rises, drifts, settles. The team aboard the research ship Hargreaves makes notes, drinks bad coffee. No one is expecting anything. Then the flutter begins, not in the machinery, in the water. As if something large just moved through the silt ahead, not close enough to see, but big enough to be noticed. The water itself has that too still feeling again. The kind that makes your ears pop even when you're watching from miles away. The first disruption lasts only 3 seconds. The feed cuts, not due to error, not static, just gone. Then it returns, and the camera's angle has shifted slightly to the left, and you see it. A surface fills the frame, pale, textured, organic, smooth but segmented, ridged in the way a tongue might be, or a limb, or the side of a creature far too large to fit inside the image. No visible eye, no mouth, no fins. Just a mass of strange flesh, moving like it's been underwater for centuries. Then something slides into view. A curve, not slow, not chaotic, controlled. It curls like a tree branch, but there are no trees down here. It coils. The texture isn't scales. It's something stranger. Not suckers exactly. Not like a squid. More like nodules, like pressure sensors, or armor. It flexes once, just once, and the feed goes black. This time it stays black. No audio, no sonar, no telemetry. The Hargreaves crew initiates the fail-safe ping, the tether initiate ascent, but nothing happens. The sub doesn't rise. For 11 minutes, they try everything. Then, without warning, 5 seconds of static arrive, and a single still frame. It's blurry greenish from algae or film or something. But in the bottom right corner, a curve, tapered, ribbed. The same shape, the same texture, a piece of a limb, and then nothing. ROV 327 is never recovered. Officially, the incident is written up as catastrophic failure. The region is logged as geologically unstable. The private sponsor pulls funding. The ship is reassigned. Case closed, but the footage circulates, not to the public. Not yet, but in sealed rooms and hushed symposiums, among ex-military sonar analysts, among cryptic marine biologists who wear their reputations like glass armor. The tentacle is real, and it was never the whole creature. It was just a part, a probe, a finger, Some argue it was a giant squid, but giant squid don't live this deep. They don't survive at 36,000 feet. They max out at about $3,000. Even the colossal squid stays far above trench levels. Nothing lives down here, except maybe something does. A few speculative biologists propose a new class of organism, Hadal colossus. Not a squid, not a fish, not a whale. Something else. Something adapted to pressure like we adapt to weather. A creature that doesn't navigate by light or echo, but by memory. Muscle tuned to viscosity. Eyes evolved for zero visibility. A being built for the trench. The sucker pattern in the image is unlike anything cataloged. It's not random. It's mosaic, tiled, purposeful. One theory suggests they're not suckers, but sensors, touch organs, thermoreceptors. They allow the creature to feel its surroundings, maybe even the movement of tectonic plates. Another theory, more unsettling, suggests this wasn't an accidental encounter. That the tentacle reached for the sub, which implies more than curiosity. It implies awareness. Ask the acoustic engineers what they heard from that trench in the weeks after. One hydrophone picked up a low-frequency groan, 47 seconds long, uninterrupted. It didn't match geological movement. It wasn't whale song. It was directional, like a warning, or a lament. The ocean's deepest zones aren't just unexplored. They're protected, not by us, by the very pressure that keeps us out. And sometimes, when we force our way in, when we send our little machines down blinking and beeping, something responds. Something that doesn't want to be seen. Something that removes the evidence. ROV 327 is gone. The camera was swallowed, crushed, or simply turned away. The final image, that curve, that limb, that nodular coiling shape, has been passed around marine biology circles for over a decade now. They all agree it's not coral, it's not rope, and it's not machinery. Some say it's part of an ancient lineage, a species that learned to stay deep as we rose toward the sun. That it watches us the way we watch shadows, with caution and with calculation, because the sea is full of giants. But the deepest ones, they're quiet, not out of fear, out of choice. The ROV's final image still flickers behind your eyes when you move on to the next anomaly. You're not ready. But the ocean doesn't care. It's already showing you the next thing, not in a recording this time, but in a rumor, a ripple, a clip too short to be useful and too sharp to ignore. It starts in 2017, off the coast of New Zealand. You're watching a live feed from a compact ROV, drifting near the Kermadec Trench. The water is black, of course. Not black like ink, but black like time, thick, slow, indifferent. The vehicle's lights sweep across a vertical escarpment. Shale, sponge, pale fish, darting like regret. And then, without warning, a shape crosses the frame. Not close, not detailed, just a shadow. Except you know how shadows behave underwater. They blur, they fade, they smudge into gradients and vanish. This one doesn't. It moves left to right, slow, immense, and it carries weight. You feel it, even watching from a desk. You can tell the light is changing. It catches something along the body, a shimmer, a texture like scales, and then it's gone. But not before you see the most damning thing of all, a tail. Not the flat horizontal fluke of a whale. Not the long ribbon-like flow of an eel. This one is vertical. It moves side to side the way reptiles swim. You freeze the frame. You blink. You zoom in. It's unmistakable. A vertical tail fin. A subtle ridgeline. A shimmer of light across overlapping plates. and a motion that doesn't drift. It drives forward. The ROV camera shakes as if the vehicle caught its own fear. You rewind the footage. You play it again. The shape is mostly obscured. No head, no eyes, no jaws. Just the back end of something too fast, too strong, and too reptilian to belong here. You remember the textbooks. You remember that vertical tail movement is characteristic of fish and reptiles, the ancient ones. Horizontal is mammalian. Whales, dolphins, seals, all the friendly megafauna, you're told, are the kings of the sea. But this is something older. You dig further and find the name echoing through deep forums and private biology groups: mosasaur, a marine lizard from the late Cretaceous, bigger than a T-Rex, jaws like a snake, body like a crocodile welded to a torpedo, up to 50 feet long, teeth curved backward to trap prey, eyes forward for hunting. It didn't chase its prey, it overtook it, and it's extinct. Of course, obviously, wiped out in the great extinction that took the dinosaurs. Except you start seeing other whispers. A sonar contact off the Bonin Islands. Long, fast, moving without ascent or descent. Tracked for 20 seconds before vanishing. A strange paired clicking pattern recorded off the coast of Argentina. Didn't match any known whale. When filtered through spectrum analysis, the nearest sound signature resembled a reptile. A private submersible in Madagascar reports a pressure shift. The water itself moves. Silt clouds spin. Nothing seen. But the captain says something brushed the side, something big. Bigger than the sub. You start connecting lines. The first mosasaur fossils were found in the Netherlands, but some of the most intact skeletons came from Madagascar, from South America, from New Zealand. And now, the anomalies align with those points. The trench sightings, the audio, the pressure anomalies. It's not proof. But it's not coincidence either. Still, you ask the question, how could it survive? Mosasaurus was cold-blooded, ectothermic. It needed warm seas. The deep is freezing, almost lifeless. How would a reptile endure that? You remember the coelacanth, a fish thought extinct for 65 million years, found alive in 1938. You remember the megamouth shark, unseen until 1976. You remember the Greenland shark, blind, slow, barely alive, but living up to 500 years beneath the Arctic ice. Evolution doesn't care about your assumptions. What if a strain of mosasaur adapted, grew smaller, colder, leaner, developed a thicker hide, a deeper lung capacity, migrated downward instead of outward, fed on giant squid or bioluminescent fish or each other? Maybe it doesn't need to surface anymore. Maybe it surfaces once a year, once a decade. You remember the carcass pulled up by Soviet trawlers, the sketch of a broad snout, the eye, the gills, the tail length estimated at 20 meters, and the thing was partially decomposed. The photo vanished. The logs were scrubbed. But the idea stayed. What if extinction was only partial? What if we didn't see them because they moved deep into canyons, ridges, trench systems? What if the darkness was not a hiding place, but their home? You dig deeper. The 2017 footage, grainy but real, was anonymously posted to a biology forum, pulled within hours. Someone tried to track the uploader. IP vanished, but the video remains in fragments. One marine paleobiologist wrote in the comments, "If that's a fish, it's a fish built like a predator." Then their account was deleted. You find more. In 2021, a Japanese fishing boat recorded sonar of something long and serpentine. It curved, moved in pulses. They thought it was a net echo, but the object never slowed. It swam beneath them. No splash, no wake, just shadow. In 2023, a research buoy off Madagascar registered a sudden pressure shift. The water rose by 14 centimeters in 1 minute, as if something displaced it from below. They blamed thermal expansion, but you know better. You lean back. You imagine it a shape gliding silently just above the trench floor, invisible from above, breathing slowly, eyes watching. Maybe it's alone. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's the last of its kind. Or maybe it isn't. Extinction, you realize, is just a theory, a working hypothesis, one we've never tested this far down. The mosasaur may not be back because it never left. You're not alone out here. Not in the way you used to think. Not in the poetic, stargazing, galaxy-brained kind of way. No, this is a different loneliness. The kind that feels like being watched when no one is supposed to be watching. The kind that doesn't come with a scream, but a blink. At first, it was a visual glitch. That's what the ROV team called it in 2005 when reviewing footage from a deep dive in the Gulf of Mexico. Just a flicker, they said. A flicker caught by a technician on frame 12, 3492, small reflections at the edge of the dome light. Perfectly round, perfectly spaced, gone in 2 frames. No motion, no blur, no object. Just 2 faint glints, side by side, hovering in the black. They joked about it. Mermaid paparazzi, camera shy, Atlantis resident, the usual. But when it happened again, different dive, different crew, different ocean, the jokes stopped. This time, it was in the Indian Ocean, near an abyssal plain, with no vent activity and no known large species. Same pattern. 2 reflections, 2 lights, perfectly still, perfectly symmetrical, and then gone. That's when the whispers started. The term they began to use quietly, and never in writing, was abyss eyes. You've reviewed the footage now, all of it. The lighting is terrible, the movement is minimal, but the reflections, they're real, and they're always the same distance apart, always aligned horizontally, always positioned just at the edge of the vehicle's light radius, never inside it, as if something knows exactly how far our vision reaches and stays just beyond it. One operator, Kyle the guy, who flagged frame 88024 during a Chilean trench scan, put it best. It was like it blinked. Not a shutter, not a mechanical close, a blink, as if whatever those lights belonged to would testing the light, then gone. This is what gets to you. It's not that the ocean is full of strange lights. It is. Bioluminescence is practically mandatory once you descend past the sun's jurisdiction. There are comb jellies, viperfish, anglerfish, flashlight fish. Some pulse, some flicker, some glow, but they move, they wiggle, they drift, they swim. Even when they're being still, you can see the water pressure pushing them, the faint rocking of life. Not the abyss eyes. They don't swim. They hover, and they disappear without leaving a wake. You asked a marine biologist once, Dr. Lena Moreno, specialist in deep-sea photoreception, if there's any known creature with that kind of control. She hesitated. Then she said, "It's not that they can't exist. It's that if they do, they're choosing to exist outside of how we observe. In other words, they're avoiding us." That chills you more than the sightings, Because it implies something else, awareness. You remember that 2017 dive in the Philippine Trench? A Japanese team ran a submersible into a canyon wall and caught what they thought were fish swimming nearby. But in post-analysis, 4 reflections showed up, not 2. Not moving in chaos, but staggered. Too near, too far, like a group, like formation. Then they all turned at once and vanished. Synchronicity, not biology, behavior. In higher species, synchronized gaze means shared attention, shared awareness. In humans, it's called joint intent. In predators, it's called coordination. You don't want to think about that, but you can't stop. You dig further. In 2021, a Chilean AI system scanning ROV footage flagged something labeled unrecognized symmetrical pattern. Not a fish, not a rock, 2 lights, then a blur, then gone. The AI categorized it under unknown biological artifact. You slow the footage, 1/60th speed. There's a shape, not clear, not whole, just enough to make your brain fill in the rest. Angular, curved, like the cheek of something massive, and you realize you've been looking for the creature, but the creature's been looking at you. That's when the theory hits. What if these are not creatures in the traditional sense? Not animals with spines and organs and classification. What if they're a new category? Something evolved to remain undetected. There's a name for this idea. Hyper-captics. Creatures whose evolutionary drive isn't speed or size or camouflage, but absence. Not hiding in plain sight. Just not being seen. Not giving off heat. Not giving off echo. Not even casting a reflection. Except sometimes, just once, they blink as if to say, yes, I'm here. You start cataloging the sightings. 2005, Gulf of Mexico, brine pool edge glints. 2008, Indian Ocean, sediment wall. 2011, Mid-Atlantic Ridge, single blink followed by sonar dropout. 2017, Philippine Trench, grouped lights, coordinated motion. 2021, off Chile, symmetry AI flag. 2023, South Sandwich Trench. Unconfirmed, but 1 tech on board claimed I saw it blink twice. 6 cases, maybe more. Always 2. Always at the periphery, never accompanied by motion, never captured in full, just seen. Briefly, you feel the pattern forming. They're not hunting us, they're watching. They're tracking our cameras, our machines, our submersibles. They know when we're there. They may even understand what we're trying to do. Not because they're evil, not because they're alien, because they've always been here before we sent lights, before we sent cables, before we built drones and domes and pressure-resistant steel. They were already in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, we've finally seen their eyes. Just once, just enough. And that was all they wanted. You drift now toward a part of the South Atlantic you never expected to fear. East of Brazil, the São Paulo Ridge stretches like a jagged scar across the seafloor, fractured, forgotten, and according to most geological surveys, entirely unremarkable. Until something woke up. It started quietly, as these things always do. In 2011, a consortium of oil companies was running deep-sea surveys along the ridge, scanning for potential drilling sites. Nothing sinister, nothing even particularly interesting, until a sonar sweep bounced off something that shouldn't have been there. The anomaly was labeled SP-A27, just another blip among thousands. But this one didn't act like stone. The first unmanned drones showed odd readings. Echo delays, temperature spikes, flickers of distorted light. And so, the team scheduled what they called a visual follow-up, a manned dive, using a submersible known as Orca 5. The dive began at 9:00 a.m. The ocean was calm. The launch crew joked over coffee. At 920 meters, the submersible began to experience optical haze. Not a malfunction, just refracted light. Bent oddly, as if something denser than water had slipped between the sub and its surroundings. Then something shimmered in front of them. Not a light, not a shape, a wall, vertical, transparent, rippling like heat distortion underwater. Except this wasn't heat. This was presence. As if something enormous, unseen, and gelatinous stood between the sub and the seabed. The crew's descriptions afterward would never match completely. One called it a veil. Another said it was like jelly with veins. A third said it was a breathing cathedral. All agreed on one thing: it pulsed. Not rapidly. Not like a heart. Like pressure. Like a giant bladder slowly inhaling. The entire structure or organism contracted slightly and then expanded. Not violently, not threateningly, but enough to fog the sub's windows with condensation from within the hull. That's when the camera systems began to fail. Not from pressure, not from electrical short. They melted, literally melted. One of the technicians later described finding optical wiring fused together like cooked sugar. No fire, no sparks, just chemical breakdown, like the heat had bloomed from inside the circuits without touching the hull. As if the light had been burned out of the lenses rather than the machines themselves. The sub surfaced early. The crew was pale, silent, and the logs were locked. They said little publicly, only that the dive had encountered anomalous thermal interference. But one of the divers, Dr. Ana Roas, a geobiologist, wrote something in a private field journal. She wrote, it wasn't a creature. It was a chamber. A translucent structure big enough to hold a house, maybe a ship. I don't think it's alive the way we think of life, but I think it breathes. And it knew we were there. You reread that entry until your eyes hurt. Then you find the footage from one of the unmanned drones that returned to the site a day later. It only recorded for 30 seconds before the feed was cut. But that was enough. It shows light, not artificial, not from the sub. Bioluminescence, faint but unmistakable. A column of glow, not from above, not from below. Inside, the light pulses not in waves, but in gradients like lungs, filtering out light instead of air. In the footage, you see a shape, or at least the edges of one. A curve, a slight arc. Something that resembles a jellyfish if jellyfish were the size of buildings. Something without symmetry, or maybe something with too much symmetry. Then static. The drone returned intact. But the memory card was warped, not the files. The hardware. The plastic had blistered slightly, like it had been exposed to low heat over hours. Except the dive had only lasted 12 minutes. A marine technician reviewing the dive later asked a question that still echoes in your head. What if it wasn't a creature? What if it was a trap? You scoffed at first. Then you found the 2011 sonar returns again. You realized something horrifying. The original Anomaly was smaller, just a bulge in the seabed. By the time of the dive, it had grown, slightly, subtly, like something reacting, something that had sensed movement, light, heat, and had begun to rise. That's when you stop thinking of it as a creature and start thinking of it as a lure. A gelatinous lure. A trap scaled not for fish, but for us. One speculative theory calls it a sensory mesh, an organic structure deployed by a larger organism to attract, absorb, or study prey. It doesn't chase. It doesn't sting. It waits. It shifts. It pulses. And when you get close enough to see it, it's already too late. But that begs the question, what laid it? Because if the São Paulo Ridge anomaly is the trap, then where is the hunter? You look back at the dive logs. The site was scrubbed. The coordinates blurred on public bathymetric maps. A private memo between engineers hinted that sonar now shows a silence in that area. Not an empty return, a missing one. As if sound itself goes in and doesn't come out. One drone launched 3 months later picked up a ripple across the surface of the anomaly, not a current ripple, not a water disturbance. A perfect, concentric vibration, a single motion, a blink if such a thing could be made of jelly and patience. Today, no one dives there. The oil companies abandoned their surveys. The name SP-A27 never appeared in any published research. The melted camera still sits in a climate-controlled archive in Brazil. But sometimes sonar operators scanning the South Atlantic will catch a soft distortion, just a smear, an absence of echo in a place that should bounce sound like a drum, and they'll mark it and move on and say nothing. Because they know, somewhere in that quiet stretch of ocean, there is a thing that doesn't move like an animal, doesn't glow like a fish, doesn't pulse like a heart. It waits. And when we find it again, when someone gets too close, it won't be because it revealed itself. It'll be because it allowed us just once. And once will be enough. The water near the Arctic shelf doesn't move like it should. It drags, like it remembers. The Soviet whaling ship Slava 9 probably didn't know that in 1954. They weren't looking for monsters or legends, just oil meat and the cold efficiency of maritime industry. The Arctic was full of whales, bowheads, narwhals, blues if you were lucky. The kind of whales that brought back tons of yield and government medals if you filled the hold fast enough. But that summer, something else came up in the nets. You've seen the photograph. It's not high-res, not clear. It was tucked between ration forms and engine logs stuffed into a leather-bound crew journal that surfaced in Norway after the fall of the Soviet Union. The image has faded edges and warped exposure, but it's unmistakable. A crane hoists a bulk shape from the ship's blood-slick deck. Tarps hang off its body like soggy flags. Its skin is rough, not like a whale's too pocked, too fibrous. A dorsal ridge runs along its back, and the tail curled slightly under its weight isn't horizontal like a mammal's. It's vertical and huge. In the corner of the image, just below a watermark stamp, are two penciled letters, MK. You follow the trail. The ship's manifest, what's left of it, lists a single entry out of Sequence Unit 23. Special classification, do not open. Route Murmansk, Arkhangelsk, Novaya Zemlya, nothing else. Just that. And then silence. You check the weight listed, 6.4 metric tons. You do the math. That's not a whale carcass. At least not one on record. Not a beluga. Not a narwhal. Not even a young blue. It's too heavy, too dense. And then there's the shape. You find notes from a Soviet technician later reassigned to meteorological stations. The man describes in a private letter, ventricle, gills the size of stove flues, and a shredded caudal edge as if the thing had been attacked before it died. No DNA testing, no tissue samples that survived. But you track one more clue. Dental remains. The record is half legible, A shipping note that mentioned serrated cartilage blades found loose in the animal's throat cavity. Unlike fish bones, unlike shark teeth, these were blade-like, pale and curved slightly backward, like the ones found in Megalodon fossils, except these weren't fossilized. These were soft. The official explanation never materialized. Most of the records were buried, shredded, or misfiled into oblivion. The ship continued its route. The carcass was never mentioned again. But for those who've seen the photo, who've studied the logistics, the sea routes, the haul records, there's only one conclusion. They pulled something up that shouldn't exist. A modern megalodon carcass. You sit with that phrase. It feels absurd, too loaded with pop culture and History Channel specials. But you remember the facts. Autodus megalodon, one of the largest predators Earth ever produced. Up to 60 feet long, 60 tons in weight. A bite force capable of splintering a small boat. Teeth bigger than your hand. Apex hunter of warm oceans, and extinct. Supposedly, for over 3 million years. But that's assuming the fossil record tells the whole story. That's assuming we've mapped the entire ocean. That we'd know if something that big still swam below us. The truth is, we wouldn't. You check the deep trenches near the Arctic. The Siberian shelf is full of thermal pockets, current inversions, undersea ridges that hide canyons miles wide. Much of it remains unmapped. Ice coverage for half the year. Visibility near zero. Communication distorted by magnetic drift. It's a perfect hiding place. You find other reports, unofficial of course. A sonar return near Franz Josef Land, logged in 1996 by a NATO sub, detected an object 20 meters long, traveling 12 knots against the current. It changed direction 3 times, then vanished. A Greenland fishing trawler in 2002 pulled up a net torn in half with bite marks spaced 1.2 meters apart. Clean, curved, not orca, not ice shear, just gone. A Japanese research station found a beached whale carcass missing its entire back half, not scavenged. Ripped. Always the same conclusion, unknown damage. Vessel strike, orca predation, ice collapse. But they all whisper the same question. What if something still hunts whales? You remember the saying among Arctic crews, the one that never appears in logs or safety briefings. Don't drag the bottom too deep. Something might drag back. You used to think it was superstition. Now you're not so sure. You return to the photograph one more time. The ridgeline, the frost. The eye just barely visible under a curtain of ice, glassy and too large for its socket. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't a misidentification. This was something big, something dead. But recently, because the tissue was still intact and the body showed signs of predation, the implication is clear. If it was a megalodon, it was alive not long before. But something killed it, which means something bigger might still be out there. You start scanning modern satellite tracking data. Whales sometimes vanish from telemetry. Tags fall off. Pressure bursts, destroy equipment. But every year, a few just go silent. Pods scatter. Calls go unanswered. And every so often, a dead whale washes ashore with bite marks too wide to name. And no one files a report. Because what would it say? Carcass retrieved. Too large to explain. Possibly extinct predator involved. That doesn't go over well at the funding meeting. So the records vanish. The photos get lost. And we pretend the ocean has no teeth we haven't already named. But deep in the Arctic, the current still drags like memory. And the ships that trawl those waters still look down warily. Because once, not that long ago, a crane pulled up a thing that shouldn't exist. And somewhere in the dark, the hunter that made it dead may still be swimming, waiting for the next thing that thinks it's safe to drag the bottom. You were told the ocean had no kings left, not since the whales rose, not since the sharks lost their megafauna, not since the leviathans died. But what if that last part isn't true? You've seen the teeth, not models, not artist renderings, fossils, real ones dug from the cliffs of Peru, where ancient seabeds once boiled with life and death. Teeth longer than steak knives, thick at the base, and curved slightly inward, like the jaws that held them were built to tear, not just capture. And they did tear. Livotan Melville, named for both the biblical Leviathan and the man who dreamed of Moby Dick, was a creature of contradictions. A whale, yes, but not a filter feeder. Not a gentle colossus floating through krill clouds. This was a hunter of whales. Imagine a sperm whale, only angrier. With a bite force that didn't crush squid, but snapped vertebrae. Teeth in both jaws, something even today's whales don't have. It didn't sing. It didn't dive and dream. It fought against Megalodon, no less, the prehistoric shark that shared its waters. For 1,000,000 years, these two apex predators coexisted, or competed, or perhaps co-evolved around each other's threat, and then they were gone, vanished. No dramatic impact crater, no mass extinction marker for Leviathan. Not like the dinosaurs. It simply stopped appearing in the fossil record. You ask paleontologists why. They don't know. Climate change? Maybe. Their prey migrated. Oxygen levels dropped. Ice crept closer to the equator. Orcas evolved and became smarter, more social. But those are guesses. No bones in the wrong strata. No conclusive timeline. It's as if they slipped out of history, not burned out, which leaves a question you can't ignore. Where did the hunters go? And why does the ocean still act like it remembers them? You hear the stories even now. Sperm whales surfacing with deep rake marks. Orcas shifting their migration paths without explanation. Hydrophone stations recording interruptions in whale song, not gaps. Stops, like something silences them mid-call. In 1997, there was the bloop, that now infamous low-frequency sound recorded across the Pacific. People say it was ice shifting, but some still insist it was alive. The pitch, the tone, the volume, and you remember the coordinates. The bloop's origin was not far from the South Pacific Gyre, a deep, silent part of the sea with no currents and no known activity. A marine desert, or a sanctuary, or a territory. You read deeper into historical logs, sailing records from the 1800s, whaling vessels that reported attacks not from whales fighting back, but from something larger. Ships struck from below, holes torn at the bow, harpoons ripped clean from the deck. They blamed rogue waves, but the logs mentioned something else. Sounds, deep roars that vibrated through the hull before impact. Like underwater thunder without the storm. You can dismiss a lot of things, but not the scars. There are fossilized whale bones with puncture wounds matching Leviathan's dental pattern. Healed wounds. That means they weren't just killing. They were fighting each other, holding territories, competing. This was not a solitary predator. It was a leviathan with intent. So what if one survived? You look again at that 2003 sonar anomaly recorded off the coast of New Zealand, a moving shadow 100 meters long near a trench shelf where nothing should swim. It wasn't just size. It was the way it moved, with mass, with rhythm, with deliberate direction. Then there was the 2015 hydrophone recording. One long exhale, subaudible, felt more than heard. It lasted 39 seconds. One marine researcher described it as like the earth sighing, except it came from the trench wall. And it moved. Triangulation placed it at 4,700 meters. That's deeper than any known whale can survive, but not deeper than one that's adapted. You run the numbers. If a leviathan had evolved to handle pressure, developed reinforced cartilage, slower metabolism, deeper lungs, it wouldn't need to surface often. It could store oxygen like sperm whales do. Dive for hours. Hunt at crushing depths. Use sonar, not to locate prey, but to paralyze it. And it wouldn't need to be many, just one. One male. One dominant survivor. Holding a trench like a king holds a ruined kingdom. You wonder what it eats. Whales, perhaps. The weak. The old. The ones who swim too close to where the calls go silent. Or maybe it's moved on to easier prey. There's a 2020 report, unofficial, from a deep-sea survey vessel that lost power after a low-frequency signal triggered its emergency shutoff. The engineers found no fault, no water breach, just a black box recording that ended with a thud and what one technician described as a growl underwater. They laughed it off. You didn't, because you've heard the same description now 4 times. Different oceans, different crews, the same feeling, the sense of being measured. You've started to suspect the Leviathan isn't just a relic. It's a response to our machines, to our noise, to our presence where we don't belong. Imagine it, a predator that survived by waiting, not hunting. Hibernating, perhaps. Slowing its metabolism until something stirs it. Sonar, turbines, submersibles. Maybe we didn't wake it. Maybe we replaced its prey. You write it in your notes. Leviathan, not extinct, just resting. Because some creatures don't need to roam anymore. They've already claimed the deep, and when they move, it isn't with hunger, it's with memory. Because the ocean doesn't forget. It holds on to what worked, and it never really lets go of its kings. You start hearing it in the data, not in the sound clips, not yet, just in the pressure logs, the tide markers, the subsurface sensors humming like mechanical lungs. Patterns emerge, but they're not in motion, they're in rhythm. The Pacific rise isn't quiet. It stretches for thousands of miles, running like a scar from the Gulf of California to the Antarctic edge. It's supposed to be geologically noisy, tectonic, volcanic, vented, a place where new seafloor is born. But that's not the sound you find. What you hear isn't eruption, it's breathing. That's the only word that fits. It started in the 1990s. A network of pressure gauges was deployed across the ocean floor to study climate impact and seafloor deformation. The idea was simple: track subtle shifts, map the slow stretch of the planet's skin. Then the anomalies started, pressure fluctuations so massive they couldn't be tidal. Not sudden, not destructive, just slow and regular, like a sleeper rolling over, like a chest expanding, then contracting, over and over, every 12 to 18 hours. At first, it looked like a glitch, equipment drift, calibration errors. But the patterns, repeated from multiple sensors, hundreds of kilometers apart, always in the same part of the East Pacific rise, always at the same frequency. No seismic activity, no vent bloom, no heat spike, just a change in pressure, like something beneath the crust was swelling and shrinking in intervals. Breathing. You want to laugh. You almost do. But then you find the sound files. They didn't release them publicly. Most weren't even labeled biological. But one engineer uploaded an audio clip, 3 minutes of low-frequency pulse, barely audible. Sub-bass. You play it on loop, and then you realize it isn't sound. It's motion, water moving in ways it shouldn't. Directional vibration, a downward pulse followed by a harmonic echo. Not seismic, not random, like lungs compressing and releasing. The audio matches the pressure wave, timing almost perfectly, and the wave carries over 200 kilometers. You bring in acoustic specialists, quiet ones. They nod. They listen. They tell you what you already fear. If it's a geological feature, it's resonating like a biological one. You ask the next question, the obvious one. Could it be a creature? They hesitate. Then say, not a creature like we know, but possibly an organism. Not a single animal, not a fish, not a whale. Something bigger, something embedded. The idea takes root, a speculative model called a deep rift breather, a living system the size of a mountain resting within the crust itself, using pressure gradients and chemical thermals to metabolize. Not eating, not hunting, just existing, waiting. That's when you find the drone footage. A deep dive vehicle, Noctiluca, made a pass in 2014 over what was supposed to be a dormant trench wall. It filmed a depression, 60 meters wide, 8 meters deep, with oddly scalloped edges. Not slumped like landslide damage. More like something had exhaled. At the center, a swirl of silt drifted upward, then stopped, then rose again, exactly 27 minutes later. The pattern was so perfect, it confused the AI model into flagging it as mechanical. But there was no machine down there, just the swirl, the pulse, and then stillness. That's when the anomaly logs started using a new term, Breather South 2. You track more of them. Event Slope Rise 9G, Node Echo 3D. They're not published. They don't appear in public seismic catalogs, but you find references in restricted hydroacoustic archives. Files marked unclassified uncertainty, inside waveform diagrams, and a line written in one of the reviews, do not assume all anomalies are mechanical. You sit with that for a long time. You begin to ask questions that make people uncomfortable. What if this isn't one organism? What if it's many? Or worse, what if it's not an organism at all, but a symbiosis? Biologists speak of coral reefs as superorganisms, forests, mycelium networks. What if the ocean floor isn't dead rock but a host? What if something lives within the fault lines, not parasites, not invaders, inhabitants, ancient ones, quiet ones, things that evolved not to flee danger, but to merge with geology, to be mistaken for stone, for sediment, for emptiness. And when we laid our instruments down, we started hearing them. Worse, maybe they started hearing us. You dive into cultural records. You find old Polynesian chants to Tangaroa, god of the sea, who sleeps beneath the waves, breathing the tide. You find Mapuche myths of Trent. Tren, a deep creature who causes land to rise and fall when disturbed. Even modern Chilean fishermen speak of El Durmiente the sleeper, who wakes only when too many lights gather above. They're just stories, of course, but they all share the same image, rhythmic motion beneath the sea, silence punctuated by deep breath, stillness that watches. Then you find the final report. A sonar dome deployed during an equipment test picked up a pressure anomaly lasting over 9 hours. A continuous rhythmic pulse, not chaotic, not seismic, just steady. Like the sea itself had grown lungs and decided to breathe. The file was labeled Event 347B. The internal notes simply called it the sleeping one, And now, you wonder what would happen if it wakes, if something that size stirred in earnest, not to hunt, not even to rise, just to move. Would we feel it? Would we hear it? Would we even recognize it? You close the file. You listen again to the pulse. You stop hearing it as sound and start hearing it as warning. Because maybe the ocean isn't trying to tell us something. Maybe it's trying to not be heard. But we've sent down lights. We've shouted with sonar. We've drilled. We've disrupted. We've pulled up core samples and ROVs and ancient tissues that don't belong. And maybe something in the deep is taking a breath, getting ready. And when it exhales, really exhales, it won't be water that rises. It will be history, the kind that was never written down, because it was buried alive. You've always heard about the Bermuda Triangle. Strange vanishings, lost time magnetic anomalies. Most of it reads like airport paperbacks and radio call-in shows. Easy to mock, easier to ignore. But you know where the real mystery sits. Not in Bermuda, not in headlines, but just off the Puerto Rico Trench. This is the deepest part of the Atlantic Ocean. It runs for hundreds of miles, the kind of abyss that even bathymetric maps hesitate to define. A scar in the Earth's crust so narrow, so dark, and so unvisited that entire mountain ranges could exist inside it without notice. And maybe something already does. The event logs call it Object Zero. No poetic names this time. No Leviathan. No Sleeping One. Just zero. The kind of name scientists give when they run out of theories and need to label their own silence. It begins with an acoustic anomaly. In 2009, an oceanographic vessel, Aurelia Seku, was mapping mid-Atlantic tectonics when its sonar array captured something strange. Not a noise, a gap. A place where the signal should have bounced, should have returned, but simply didn't. Like sound had slipped into something that swallowed it whole. Then the vessel's pressure readings spiked, but only beneath it. Imagine you're floating 7,000 meters above the bottom. Nothing should be directly below except water and trench wall. But suddenly, the water pushes back like a passing subway train beneath your feet, except the floor is the entire ocean. The crew marked it as a deep gas vent. Makes sense, right? Until the same thing happened again. 2 days later, same location, identical pressure profile, no visible disturbance, no venting, just that impossible silent push. They lowered a drone. What it recorded still sits in encrypted archives, but 2 frames leaked. You've seen them. Frame 1, pure darkness. Typical at that depth. A faint edge of trench wall. Nothing unusual. Frame 2, a shape. A long curved outline stretching across the frame at a distance of 200 meters. No detail. Just scale. And an absence of reflectivity so complete, it bends light. It doesn't glow. It doesn't shimmer. It absorbs. And then it's gone. The feed cuts out. The drone doesn't return. But this time, the crew doesn't report equipment failure. They write it up as a retreat. You don't see that word often in field logs, but they meant it. They pulled the drone back when the pressure wave returned not from below, but from the side, as if something had moved faster than any current, and the crew. Every one of them refused trench operations afterward. You find their internal notes. One sentence keeps appearing. It moved like it didn't care we were watching. You feel the shift then. The weight of this isn't in teeth, or claws, or growls in the deep. It's in indifference. Whatever Object Zero is, it doesn't react like a predator. It doesn't flee. doesn't attack. It moves when it chooses, rests where it wants, and sometimes, rarely, it notices us. Or maybe it doesn't, and that's worse. You look at the telemetry again. The shape's movement wasn't defensive. It didn't evade. It continued its path, right through the trench wall, right through solid stone, except that wall. It didn't rupture, it folded. A geological feature, the kind that should take millennia to deform, bent in response. You go back to the sonar returns. Every expert says the same thing. This object displaces too much water to be an animal, and yet here it is, gliding through blackness, ignoring rock pressure, everything we think defines the deep. So maybe it's not an animal, maybe it's not even alive, maybe it's something older than that distinction. Like the shape beneath the Azores Object Zero doesn't blink, doesn't roar, doesn't flare or react. It passes through stone, bends the sea, and leaves behind a wake of nothing. But people feel it. In 2015, a NOAA vessel detected a string of unresponsive buoys in the trench sector. Not destroyed, still pinging, but slightly off. Moved just subtly by forces unrecorded. GPS showed their positions had shifted in perfect arc formation. That's not current, that's structure. A path, as if something large, impossibly large, had carved a course across the trench floor. Not quickly, not violently, just steadily. The spacing of those buoys matched the dimensions of an aircraft carrier, or rather a dozen. But no vessel passed through, and no vessel could, because the magnetic interference would have shut down any known propulsion system. And it did. Twice naval test drones lost signal during missions near that arc. Not cut cables, not severed feeds, just off. Like a switch flipped, and when they floated back up, no memory. Black boxes wiped, like the ocean had reached in and gently removed the parts we weren't allowed to see. You think back to that trench, that silent pressure pulse, that fold in the wall, and you wonder, is this a creature or a force? A current given mass, a machine too old to identify a biomechanical entity that doesn't swim, just moves through whatever it wants. No one knows, because no one goes back. The Puerto Rico Trench has quietly become one of the most understudied deep zones in the Atlantic. The excuse is budget cuts, survey priorities, equipment safety, but the real reason, you can feel it in the silence. The researchers don't trust it. They trust the abyss, the sharks, even the anomalies, but not this, because Object Zero doesn't act like something hiding. It acts like something watching, and worse still, something waiting. Waiting for what? A signal, a mistake, or just enough time for us to forget it was ever recorded at all. You already know about the Colossal Squid, Mesonicotuthis hamiltoni. The name alone sounds made up. Too many syllables, too much menace. But it's real. It lives in the Southern Ocean, deep in the darkness beneath Antarctic currents. And despite being one of the largest invertebrates on the planet, possibly the largest, we've barely seen it. You've probably seen the images, dead ones, hauled up in nets, floating like bloated shadows on the deck of research vessels, tentacles draped over coolers, beaks wide as dinner plates, eyes the size of basketballs, hooks on their limbs, hooks, as if suction cups weren't enough. But here's the thing no one talks about. We've never filmed one alive. Not clearly, not hunting, not swimming, not being. We know they exist, but we don't know how they exist. And when something that massive lives right under our noses and still escapes our lenses, you have to ask, what else are we missing? It was thought to be shy, elusive, a deep-sea ghost content to bide its time, at abyssal depths. But there's a whisper, not scientific, not yet, that what we've found so far may just be juveniles. Or worse, discarded bodies, shed skins, deaths from something deeper still. There are scars on whales that don't match the known dimensions of any cephalopod. Tentacle wounds spanning over 40 feet. Sucker marks that wrap around a sperm whale's head. And those whales fight back. They're 50-ton juggernauts with battering ram foreheads. So what leaves them running? You find one report, unofficial, buried in the logs of a Japanese whaling ship in 1999. They weren't supposed to be near the Ross Sea, but they were. The crew wrote of a shadow that passed beneath the hull during a calm drift. No sonar ping, no splash. Just a ripple of motion so wide it felt like the ocean shrugged. Then a whale surfaced nearby, bleeding, twisting. The crew watched its eye roll, and then they saw it. A single fleshy rope whipping skyward, curling midair, then vanishing back beneath the waves. They turned and left. No catch that day, no photo, just a notation. Hai no Hongshu, tentacle of the sea. The name stuck. You find more of these records. None scientific, all anecdotal, all similar. 1986, Chilean trawler crew spots a pale limb coiling beneath a dolphin pod, dragging one down silently. 2008, an underwater oil platform records a pressure surge, a sharp directional burst with no seismic origin. 5 seconds later, all external lights flicker, then die. 2014, a deep-sea camera array in the Southern Ocean catches a veil moving across the lens. No tentacles, no eyes, just translucent flesh rippling in front of the camera, like it paused, then passed. That camera never transmitted again. You ask marine biologists how big a squid can get. Officially around 45 feet. Anything more is anecdotal. They laugh when you suggest triple that. They have to. Science doesn't deal in legend, but ask them off the record. Ask them about Messinicotuthus's metabolic rates, how it can afford to grow so large, so slow in water so cold. They'll tell you it shouldn't exist. Its mass, its musculature, its sheer bulk, it makes no sense. It breaks the rules. Then why does it live? Maybe because it doesn't compete with anything. Nothing hunts it. Nothing sees it. It lives where few creatures dare go. Or maybe we've only seen the ones that died. And the real giants are still below. You revisit a NOAA report from 2017, classified at first, later leaked in fragments. A sonar ping over the Southern Ocean catches an object moving at 5 knots large, unshaped with no drag profile. That means it wasn't metal. No propellers, no turbulence. But the kicker, the ping bounced off in rippled patterns, like a body that could absorb sonar bend. It reflected in layers. Not solid, not soft either. Think of a squid. Think of its mantle. Think of the way light passes through it if it's thin enough. Now think of that scaled up. 50 feet, 80 feet, maybe more. Something that isn't just avoiding detection, it's built for it. There's a theory you run into on a fringe biology blog, anonymously posted, quickly deleted. The colossal squid is the larval stage. The adult is abyssal, territorial, and blind. It doesn't hunt, it waits. And when it moves, it does so to eliminate intruders, not for food. For space, you dismiss it. Then you remember the oil platform blackout, the dead cameras, the impossible shadows, and you don't dismiss it anymore. You remember how little we know about cephalopods. Their distributed nervous systems, their problem-solving skills, their ability to edit RNA, their freakish camouflage, not just visual, but electromagnetic. We've studied squid brains. They're alien, not metaphorically, structurally. They evolved along a different path entirely. Their eyes developed separately from ours, independently, and yet functionally similar. That means nature built vision twice, and both times it decided to put it into creatures that stalk the dark. So what happens when something like that keeps evolving? When it doesn't die? What if the colossal squid isn't colossal at all? What if it's just colossal enough to be seen, and everything bigger simply hasn't let us look? Not yet. There's a final note. You find a handwritten comment in the margin of a deep-sea biology draft paper. No signature, no timestamp, just 3 words. We're in its cage, and suddenly it makes sense. The reason we never see them, the reason our footage fails, the reason the whales turn back, the reason the water sometimes shivers when nothing moves. They're not shy, they're not extinct, they're not monsters. They're home, and we're the ones trespassing. You think nothing can surprise you anymore. You've seen the tentacle. You've heard the sigh in the trench. You've stared into eyes that don't blink and watched stone walls ripple like fabric. But this next piece, this part of the ocean's story, doesn't arrive with a roar or a riddle. It arrives with an echo, and that might be worse. The Weddell Sea is a place people forget. It's not warm or mysterious in the classic sense. It's white, barren, a windswept stretch of frozen nothing sitting at the top of Antarctica, like the world forgot to finish drawing that corner. But beneath that sheet of ice is one of the deepest, oldest parts of the Southern Ocean, where the cold bites harder than pressure and silence is so thick sonar comes back with static. And that's where it happened. A sonar crew on board a British Antarctic survey ship, the Endurance 2, was conducting a routine scan of subglacial terrain mapping, underwater ridges, and searching for signs of calving shelf movement. But one return didn't fit. It came from a trench, not listed on any previous chart. Not because it was newly formed, but because it had always been there, just somehow never mapped. That's the first red flag. You know how these charts are made. Years of layered sonar passes, ice-penetrating radar satellite altimetry. Yet this trench had evaded all of them. Not because of interference, but because it sat just outside every planned scan route. Like the sea itself had been subtly nudging people to look elsewhere. Until now, the first sonar pass was uneventful. The second returned something unexpected, a shadow. Sonar doesn't show images like a camera. It gives you shapes, outlines, pressure bouncing back off mass. Usually, you see ridges, shelves, pillars. But this return was none of those. It was long, arched, smooth, and it moved only slightly 30 meters to the left over 2 minutes, but enough to throw the scan off. At first, they thought it was a software glitch, until the echo came, a deep, resonant tone, not sharp, not abrupt, but prolonged. It began just above 18 hertz, at the edge of human hearing, and dropped below that, sinking into subsonic territory, where you feel the sound more than hear it. It lasted 42 seconds. There were no whales in the area, no ships, no seismic activity, and the tone was directional. It didn't radiate outward. It went up, straight through 1,000 meters of seawater ice and into the listening equipment. That's not how nature sounds. That's how beacons sound. The team didn't say anything right away. They finished the pass, archived the data, and quietly submitted a note In the ship's log, unusual sonar return, subglacial movement suspected, no biological activity observed. But the audio files circulated first among sonar techs, then among the curious few who monitor naval frequencies for anomalies. You've heard it. It starts low and builds slowly as if someone is dragging a bass string across the hull of the Earth. It isn't urgent. It isn't frightened. It sounds patient. Some say it's the ice settling. Others say it's a vent releasing pressure from the crust. But one technician on the survey vessel, a veteran of dozens of expeditions, said it best. That wasn't the ocean. That was something in the ocean. The theories began to stack. One was wild, that beneath the Weddell Shelf is a biomechanical sleeper, an organism too large to live anywhere else, too old to rise, too quiet to hear unless it wants to be heard. Another theory said the trench is a mouth not metaphorically, but literally, a massive biological intake vent connected to something that uses water pressure thermal gradient and time to feed. That's when you start hearing whispers about a second tone, captured a week later. Identical duration, identical pitch. But this time, it ended with a pulse, a single upward tick in frequency, like a question being asked. Sonar experts tried to recreate it. They couldn't, not because they lacked the tools, but because the tone carried harmonics, layered waveforms that suggest not just noise, but modulation. In short, it wasn't a cry. It was a signal. You find older references hidden in declassified files from Cold War sonar stations. An almost identical echo was recorded in 1968 during an under-ice submarine test. It was filed as ice shelf shearing event, but the waveform matches almost exactly, which means the thing that made that sound, if it is a thing, has been there for at least 50 years, probably longer. One note from a French Antarctic geologist stands out. He calls the trench une gorge dormant, a sleeping throat. Not metaphorically, literally. He thought it was alive, not a whale, not a squid. Something bigger, something that doesn't move like an animal, but functions more like an ecosystem. Not a predator, a collector. You find one final log entry in the Endurance 2's archive never published. The technician who submitted the file added a postscript, maybe by accident. Just one sentence. It hurt us. You read it again. You remember the shadow, the tone, the way the sonar bounced back like the sea had grown bones. And you realize this isn't the kind of story where the monster lunges. It doesn't surface. It doesn't chase ships. It waits. The Weddell Sea isn't empty. It's occupied by something that was old when mammals were still crawling onto land. Something that can sleep without dying. Something that only needs to wake once every few centuries, maybe less. And when it does, it won't rise in hunger or rage. It'll rise because we kept tapping, because we wouldn't stop listening, because eventually, even the deep grows tired of whispers and decides to speak. You cross into the Bay of Bengal, expecting heat, humidity, and endless shipping lanes. But that's just what floats on top. Below, the Ganges Trench yawns like a sunken wound, less famous than the Pacific monsters, less studied than the Atlantic deeps, and far less mapped. It stretches quietly off the Indian coast, choked by sediment from the Ganges River, heavy with centuries of runoff and myth. And that's where the signal drops. You don't even notice at first. The drone's still moving, still transmitting vitals, still alive. But the camera feed flickers, the pressure sensors drift, and the sonar goes from clean chirps to a long, low hum. Not noise, not silence, just something missing. The seafloor here is soft, almost too soft. Centuries of organic silt have piled on top of the trench walls like a wet burial shroud. Anything could hide beneath that, and maybe something does. The official mission was a seafloor scan for microplastic concentrations using a compact drone with 2 light cones and a suction core. It was supposed to skim the mud and come home. Instead, the team got 31 seconds of footage that no one could explain. You've watched it over and over. It starts with the usual blur, brownish clouds, occasional polychaete worms flicking in and out of view. Then the silt lifts just briefly, and something dark appears in the center of the frame. A surface, rounded, almost rubbery, not moving, not stone. Then the camera's light hits it, and it shudders. Not from impact, not from pressure, from awareness. The shape folds back into the silt, not rising, not escaping, just withdrawing, like it was surprised, like it wasn't expecting to be seen. And then the sonar pulses again, but this time it returns nothing. A blackout. The team assumed they hit a trench wall, maybe rolled the drone, but when it surfaced, it was undamaged. The sensors were fine. The suction unit, however, had something in it. Not mud, not worms, not plastic. A single piece of translucent tissue, smooth, dense, almost cartilage-like. Analysis revealed traces of hemocyanin, a copper-based oxygen carrier found in squid, some arthropods, and very little else. But this wasn't cephalopod flesh. It lacked the usual cellular structure. No chromatophores, no known proteins, just a kind of pulsing gel matrix that stiffened when cooled and relaxed when warmed. No creature on Earth does that. And that was before the tissue started vibrating. Not movement, vibration. Every 88 seconds, it pulsed softly, as if trying to match a frequency. A search of acoustic logs found that the exact same pulse had been recorded 6 hours earlier from the trench, from the same location where the drone had dipped. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't alone. It was connected. You look into the trench's layout. It's long. It's narrow. It curves like a sleeping serpent across the seafloor. And near its midpoint, several satellite records show a strange anomaly. A perfect circle of still water, not windless, still. As if currents bend around it, avoid it. You overlay data from the last 5 monsoon seasons. Storms that sweep in from the Bay of Bengal don't break here. They split. You check marine radio logs. 5 distress signals in 10 years, all within 20 nautical miles of the circle. No survivors. You look closer at 1 MV Shalaka, a cargo vessel bound for Chittagong. Last radio message. Water, moving weird. That's it. Not help, not engine failure. Just a report on the water's behavior. Then nothing. The wreck was never found, but wreckage floated in days later. Shipping containers warped as if crushed from above. Not by wave, not by pressure. By weight. You find another note in an Indian Navy memo. Sonar scans picked up strange topography in the trench in 2013. An undulating ridge that seemed to move between passes. Officially written off as sediment migration. Unofficially labeled mobile geologic unknown. Then there's the folklore. Fishermen in the Sundarbans speak of Jal Rakshas water demons that rise during the storm season and drag boats into the river's mouth. The tales are old, older than colonial maps, older than steel ships. One chant translated says, "It waits beneath the place where tides refuse to move. Its breath is thunder, its gaze the fog. The net will vanish, The light will bend, and no man will speak its name twice. You read that, and glance again at the footage. The way the light bent around that thing in the mud, the way the sonar failed to echo, the way the water even now avoids the trench's curve. This isn't just a creature, it's a presence, one that isn't hunting not actively. But when something strays too far, when a drone dips too deep, when a boat slides over that still spot, something shifts and takes. You find one final note buried in the analysis logs from the drone team. A tech offhandedly wrote, "It looked up." That's all. Not it moved, not it lunged. Just that. It looked up. And you realize that's the worst part. Not the attack, not the loss, the recognition. It wasn't surprised by the drone. It was surprised it was being watched, which means it didn't think we could. And now it knows better. The East Pacific Rise is supposed to be one of the most stable deep-sea regions on Earth. It's a wide, mid-ocean ridge stretching beneath the Pacific like a backbone of cooling magma. Scientists love it for its predictability, the steady creation of new crust, the regularity of its tectonic behavior, and the calm, slow undulations of its seabed. So when sonar anomalies began appearing in 2018, they didn't panic. They logged it, tagged it, and figured it was a misalignment. But then the echoes repeated perfectly. That's the part that catches your breath. You can explain one sonar glitch. You can explain a false echo from an uneven trench wall or a swarm of schooling fish, but you can't explain two identical symmetrical echoes showing up thousands of miles apart at the exact same depth, at the exact same interval, as if the sea itself blinked. And that's how this started with eyes, not real ones. Not yet. But reflections, shapes, paired sonar returns that looked somehow too deliberate. Always two, always equidistant, always staring outward. You pore over the logs. Each event is spaced across hundreds of nautical miles off the coast of Easter Island near the Galapagos Fracture Zone, deep beneath a remote slice of ocean, with no name, no traffic, no mapped activity. Each time, two pings, two arcs of sonar shadow hovering for seconds, then gone. One researcher in Mexico City dubbed them Los Ojos del Abismo, the eyes of the abyss. He meant it as a joke, until the return shifted, because the echoes weren't static. They moved, not erratically, not like fish. They followed. A research drone tracking vent plumes at 3,000 meters recorded one such pair drifting along behind it, not close, not aggressive, just parallel. Shadowing the sub at a precise distance, adjusting when it slowed, turning when it turned. The drone team didn't see them until playback. The sonar map lit up for 8 minutes. Then the reflection stopped. Because the eyes blinked, there's no better word for it. On the final frame, the sonar pings don't fade out. They contract like an aperture closing. That's not tectonics. That's not fish. That's intent. You begin to notice a pattern. Each time the echoes appear, they follow a consistent behavior. They appear 15 to 20 minutes after a drone enters the area. They maintain a constant lateral distance, never closing in. They vanish just before the drone reaches the trench floor. It's like they're watching, but not from curiosity, from territory. You ask a sonar technician, what would cause twin shadows like that? He laughs nervously and says, maybe a school of tuna in perfect formation. Then he says nothing for a while. Then quietly, or two optic structures large enough to reflect long-wave sonar suspended independently, calibrated to match vehicle speed. You don't respond, because that sounds a lot like eyes. Large ones, invertebrate eyes, don't reflect sonar. Whale eyes are too small. No known animal has two structures wide enough and precisely spaced enough to cause this pattern, not without showing a body, not without some kind of mass. But nothing appears. Only the eyes. Always the eyes. Then you find the Chili Ridge event. A deep-sea drone was mapping fissures near a minor vent chain when the water around it distorted, not temperature light. The beam from the ROV's floodlight wavered like shining through warped glass. At that exact moment, the sonar recorded the twin reflections again, this time closer than usual. Only 75 meters away. The reflections moved together. Then the light from the ROV flickered and the echoes vanished. Immediately, gone in a blink. When the drone surfaced, two things were discovered. The outer shell of its casing was covered in fine scratches radial like something had brushed against it in a circular motion. The camera lens had a single oily film across it. Not water, not sediment. A translucent smear. Protein-based. Lab analysis couldn't identify the compound. One marine biologist said it resembled vitreous fluid, the material inside eyeballs. You sit with that for a long time. Maybe it got too close. Maybe the watcher decided to watch back. There's a final report from 2022, filed quietly under an engineering failure log. A new generation of sonar buoys, highly sensitive AI calibrated deployed in the East Pacific Rise, began auto-scrambling at depth. Not from power loss, not from pressure. From feedback, the buoys began receiving sonar pulses they hadn't sent. Responses, 3 short pulses, then 2, then 1. Each time they came, the buoys froze. Not from mechanical error, from software shutdown. Someone wrote in the margin, echoes mimicking handshake patterns. These aren't glitches. They're replies. Then the project ended. Funding pulled. No further dives scheduled. No one talks about it now, but some of the crew kept the data. They noticed something everyone else had missed, the spacing of the sonar reflections. It changed. In the first logs, the eyes were close together, 120 meters apart. A year later, 150, then 180, then 230. They were growing, or moving farther apart, which means either the body is expanding, or multiple entities are coordinating over increasing range. Neither is comforting. You imagine floating through that trench floodlight, swinging in darkness, and suddenly you see them. 2 circles, reflective, unblinking, not approaching, not flinching, just watching. And you understand in that moment why the biologists stopped talking. Why the sonar engineers submitted hardware complaints but never asked for replacements. Because they know the ocean is not empty. It is aware. And sometimes it looks back. The sperm whale is the loudest animal on Earth. That's not exaggeration. It's science. Its clicks used for echolocation and communication can hit 230 decibels. Louder than a jet engine. Loud enough to disorient prey. Maybe even kill it. This is not a gentle giant humming lullabies in the dark. It's a predator. A sonar-slinging torpedo of scarred muscle and ancient instinct. And yet, in 2019, 8 of them vanished. All tagged, all tracked, all part of a multi-institution study monitoring deep dive behaviors in the Kuril Trench off the coast of northern Japan. The trench is cold, deep, and turbulent, one of the most volatile tectonic zones on Earth. But whales don't fear pressure. They thrive in it, at least, usually. It began like every other dive. The pod descended in loose formation, tagged with high-resolution transponders. Researchers followed their usual spiral patterns. Hunting squid, singing low, crackling clicks to one another like underwater campfire stories. Then at 3:22 a.m., all data went quiet. Not gradually, not glitched, just off. 8 separate whales, 8 separate tags, simultaneous loss, The researchers assumed a signal fault. Maybe the equipment malfunctioned. Maybe a software update had scrambled the relay. Until a Japanese fisheries vessel, 3 nautical miles east, picked up something in the water. Slime, glowing iridescent and warm to the touch. Floating in ribbons like jellyfish that had melted and then changed their minds halfway through the process. And inside the slime, 3 transponders, crushed. Not removed, not ejected. Crushed. Flattened like they'd been inside a car compactor. Steel casings warped inward, circuitry shattered. They weren't just disconnected. They'd been compressed. Then there was the sound. A hydrophone array, anchored along the Kural trench wall, captured a pulse 1 low-frequency pressure wave, lasting 5.4 seconds, centered at 19 hertz. It was so deep, it bypassed the primary monitoring software and had to be recovered from raw data. At first, it was dismissed as tectonic. Then, someone overlaid it on a known sperm whale distress call. The match was 87%. You hear the recording. It's not a scream. It's not even fast. It starts low, like a whisper from something enormous, then climbs, slightly warbles, and abruptly stops. No echo, no fade, just silence. The kind of silence that has aftermath. 2 days later, 1 whale surfaces near Hokkaido. Its disoriented swims in circles, breaches repeatedly as if gasping. It doesn't vocalize. When marine specialists finally reach it, they notice something else. Its eyes. They're bleeding, and not from trauma. From pressure, internal hemorrhaging, consistent with sudden decompression. As if the animal had been forced to rise too fast, not because it panicked, but because something was rising beneath it. The whale dies 8 hours later. The autopsy is sealed, but notes leak. The brain showed massive shear trauma, the kind caused by extreme directional vibration. Something shook it apart from the inside. The rest of the pod is never found. And officially, the incident is written up as loss due to geological interference. Unofficially, the researchers stop diving in the Kural Trench. You start connecting dots. This is not the only case. In 2013, off the Kermadec Arc, 2 whales surfaced with similar symptoms: burst capillaries, broken sonar teeth, erratic breaching behavior. In 2007, an American sub picked up what was thought to be a landslide rumble until someone ran it through a biological filter and found patterns. Repeating pulses, not tectonic. Targeted, like sonar, but stronger. You begin to realize that maybe whales aren't the kings of the deep after all. Maybe they're just messengers, or worse, warnings. You return to the Kural data. One strange notation stands out: equipment vibrating despite stable sea conditions. The deck wasn't moving. The air was still, but the instruments shook. From below, as if the ocean floor had hummed, not cracked, not boomed, just hummed, like a speaker, waiting to release a second note. You speak to an ex-Navy sonar officer, retired quiet, cautious. He tells you something you can't unhear. There's a frequency whales use to warn each other, a specific series of clicks, usually when they detect orca in the region. But there's another set we can't translate: fewer clicks, lower pulse rate, slower rhythm. Only ever recorded when they're near trench edges, and only right before they go silent. You ask what it means. He doesn't answer. He just leans forward and says, "I think they know something's down there, something they won't name." You revisit the slime. Bioluminescent, protein-dense, laced with traces of manganese and unknown organic compounds, almost like ink but more complex. It's not waste. It's not blood. It's residue. as if something left behind a kind of signature, a presence marker, not as a warning, not even as evidence, but like a trail. And the crushing of the tags, not incidental. It was deliberate. The devices weren't bitten. They were neutralized because they were transmitting. And maybe something down there doesn't want to be transmitted. The whales didn't die randomly. They were silenced, not killed by predators, but by something that knew they were being watched, or worse, heard. You think back to the click patterns, the way they stopped all at once, the way that final signal, the 5.4-second pulse, hit every listening device like a cold hand on a shoulder, a presence, massive, unconcerned, not a hunter, a warden of the trench, of the quiet, of something older than migration, older than fear. You realize the whales weren't attacked, they trespassed, and the deep responded. You board a military sub, thinking the danger is outside. You imagine pressure, darkness, maybe the occasional groan of the hull as the ocean reminds you that you don't belong down here. But that's not what gets to you. It's the sound, and not the kind you hear. This sub, the Icarus Blue, was on a classified dive operation off the Solomon Islands in 2016. Nothing glamorous, just a routine pressure test at depth assessing the performance of a new acoustic hull coating. Something meant to hide the sub, to muffle its presence like a blanket around a heartbeat. But at 3,900 meters, the crew heard something else. The first sign was in the comms, a whisper, not words, not static, just a low murmur threading through the intercom like wind against a sealed window. Then the instruments began to behave strangely. Not a crash, a drift, compass deviation, Doppler lag, slight, maybe just a few degrees off, but enough to make the navigator frown, then tap the console again as if the ocean was warping direction. And then came the tone. It entered at 17 hertz, well below the human hearing threshold, but still felt in the bones, like a migraine with no pain. A hum that made your teeth ache and your thoughts misalign. Something you don't hear with your ears, something your skull receives like a message. The crew stopped talking. One man threw up. Another reported feeling like he was being observed from the inside. That's when the captain made the call. Abort dive. Return to depth 0. This was a military test. These were trained professionals, sitting in one of the most advanced underwater vessels ever built. And they turned back. No threats, no breach, just a tone, and the feeling that it had noticed them. Later, the acoustic log was recovered. It's 2 minutes and 42 seconds of increasing low-frequency sound. Not a rise in volume, a rise in structure. The signal becomes more organized the deeper they go. Not a hum, not a roar. A call, not random, layered, almost like a language. Engineers tried to explain it. Theories ranged from deep tectonic harmonics to bubble cavitation under extreme pressure. But none of those explain the pattern, because at exactly 1 minute and 19 seconds, the tone splits into 2 channels, like something responding to itself. Echolocation doesn't behave that way. No whale call ever observed breaks into stereo pattern at sub-bass range. But this one did. You listen to the recording with a spectrogram overlay. You watch the harmonics bloom outward, mirror each other, cross and recross. It looks like a dialogue or a rehearsal. And then just as suddenly as it began, the tone stops. Not fades, stops. The silence afterward is jarring, almost disrespectful, like being thrown out of a dream without permission. The sub returned to the surface, systems nominal, crew dazed but physically unharmed, mostly. Two members reported severe migraines over the next week. One claimed he could still feel the tone whenever he closed his eyes. He was discharged quietly. You trace the dive logs. This wasn't the only event. A NATO vessel in 2004 picked up a nearly identical pattern in the Arctic Circle. Again, at extreme depth. Again followed by confusion, disorientation, withdrawal, and again, no one returned to the coordinates. It's not a location, it's a boundary. You contact a civilian sonar analyst who had reviewed similar acoustic events while contracted to a research group. She refers to them as containment tones. She says they appear in zones where equipment tends to fail, where drones shut down, where whales turn back. She doesn't think it's a call for help. She thinks it's a barrier, a kind of biological infrasound field, one that scrambles technology and induces discomfort in organic creatures, not by accident, by design. Think of it like an electric fence, but made of sound, a warning, or a wall. The idea is insane until you remember the effects. You revisit the crew interview transcripts from the Icarus Blue. Short, clean, military sterile, but a handwritten note, likely scribbled by a junior officer, stands out in the margin. It didn't want us to know we'd found it, so it told us to leave. The phrasing is strange. Not it scared us, not it attacked. It told us, as if it made a request or a demand. You consider the possibility. What if some entity deep in the ocean isn't hiding through passivity, but through active deterrence? It doesn't need to destroy the sub. It just needs to make it turn around. The infrasound doesn't need to deafen. It just needs to reach the part of the brain that makes decisions and convince it to leave. You wonder how many other dives ended this way. How many records were labeled equipment drift or sensor noise, when really someone inside the vessel couldn't handle the presence anymore. The tone doesn't just shake your bones. It asks a question, one you're not supposed to answer. One that says, "Why are you here?" You never figure out if it's curiosity or warning. But either way, the result is always the same. Turn around. Go back. Forget this depth. Forget this voice. And above all, don't come looking again. You don't expect color this deep. But when you drop into the waters near Tonga, where tectonic plates grind in slow submarine fury, you see it anyway. Not in the sunlit palette of coral reefs or the sharp contrast of volcanic ash. This color is something else. It glows. It pulses. It moves like it's alive. The dive was never supposed to go that far. The original mission was to study sediment layers from the 2009 Samoan earthquake. Just another routine check of seafloor deformation. But the ROV footage took a turn the moment it passed 4,000 meters. The trench lit up. You've watched the recording frame by frame. 1 second, it's the usual black abyss, grainy and still. The next, a wave of bioluminescence sweeps across the floor, like the aurora borealis forgot it belonged in the sky. Blue, violet green, even a touch of red, a shifting blanket of light rippling across the sediment. At first, you assume it's a bloom of bioluminescent plankton, or deep-sea jellies reacting to movement. Some kind of collective defensive mechanism, but the lights don't scatter. They don't react. They synchronize. Exactly 34 meters apart, dotting the trench wall like embedded nodes. Each one flashes in sequence, left to right, then top to bottom. Like a grid or a nervous system. That's not how marine organisms behave. Not spontaneously, not without coordination. Unless it's a trap or a signal. You trace the footage. The ROV hesitates, not literally, but the pilot does. You can tell. The vehicle's forward momentum pauses, then resumes slower. Warier, the lights continue, a second pulse, then a third, and then the heat spike hits, not near the vents, not from above, from beneath the trench floor. The temperature rises by 7 degrees Celsius in just under 11 seconds. That's not a vent, that's emission. Something below is heating the water directly. The sub's thermal sensors overload. The pilot loses visual for 5 seconds. When the feed returns, the grid is gone. No lights, no glow. Just empty, dark, soft silt drifting like afterthoughts. But then something far more unsettling happens. The drone's internal gyroscope begins to spin slowly at first, then more rapidly, as if the local magnetic field has twisted, as if the very direction of down is in dispute. The ROV rises. The dive ends early. Official logs mark it as a magnetic disturbance, likely due to regional tectonic activity. But behind closed doors, the researchers call it the bloom, a bioluminescent event with no clear biological source. And it's not the only one. There are reports from as far back as 1992, a French deep-sea survey in the Kermadec region noted a flash wall that followed a submarine landslide. No follow-up, no samples, just a notation in the margins. Sequence seemed too structured. A 2005 Chilean research drone recorded flickers forming concentric rings just before its tether was severed. And a 2012 Australian team investigating a minor vent field in the Tonga Trench encountered a light pattern forming a perfect spiral visible only in UV spectrum. You ask the obvious question: what emits light at those depths? What glows? The answer: not much. Jellyfish, certain squid, some fish, but never in a grid, never in perfect synchrony, and certainly never in patterns that respond to proximity. One researcher off the record suggests an extreme form of biological camouflage. Imagine this: a massive creature, or perhaps a colony of them buried beneath sediment. They've developed light-producing cells, not to lure prey, but to blend in with lightless depth. But when exposed, they flare not in panic, but in recognition. Not a warning, a greeting, or worse, a signal. Because shortly after the bloom, a pulse is recorded across the regional hydrophone network. A low thump, just one, but it's felt as far as Fiji. At first they assume it's an aftershock, until the frequency analysis reveals something unexpected. The waveform matches a 2011 recording near the Java Trench and a 1998 event near the Philippine Sea. All identical, all following reports of bioluminescent anomalies. They are not earthquakes. They're heartbeat-shaped. The wave starts sharp, then fades, then is followed by nothing. A single muscular contraction of the deep. You begin to realize the lights aren't just happening. They're timed. To what? Maybe to us. Each major dive into this region, each deployment of a sub or sonar system, happens within days of these pulses, sometimes within hours. You think about the bloom again, the lights forming a perimeter, the sudden temperature spike, the vanishing reflections. You start to see it not as a passive reaction, but as an activation. The trench lights up, not because it's disturbed, but because something inside it is waking up. Not quickly, not in anger, just stirring. You compare it to nerve cells, to muscle twitch, to reflex, and you wonder, what if the entire trench is part of something bigger? Not an animal, in the traditional sense. Not jaws and fins and hunger, but a system, a buried biomechanical intelligence, alive not in thought, but in rhythm. The bloom could be like REM sleep, and humans' bursts of neural activity signaling internal motion or external awareness. And that heat, not a vent, not volcanic, but metabolic, a rise in temperature because something began to move. The final part of the report chills you the most. The ROV's back-facing camera caught a single flash in the distance as it ascended, not in the trench. Above it, a sphere of blue light hovering in the water column for precisely 0.8 seconds, then gone. When the footage was enhanced, the light appeared to have edges. That's not how light behaves underwater, unless something solid emitted it, something shaped. That part of the log is redacted, but a handwritten note remains. We didn't trigger it. We reminded it. You lean back, you close your eyes, and you remember something terrifying. Color doesn't exist in the deep, not naturally. So when the trench lights up, it's not for you. It's for whatever's inside. Some places on the map are simply marked as deep. No name, no warning. Just contour lines that stretch too wide, too steep, and vanish into gradients that even satellites hesitate to resolve. One such place sits between the Seychelles and Madagascar, a quiet patch of the Indian Ocean, with no nearby tectonic activity, no known volcanic ridges, and no history of seismic violence. And yet, ships avoid it, not officially. No restrictions, no red zones. But shipping routes bend subtly around it. Submarine cables divert to the east. Oceanographers rarely sample it, not because they're afraid, but because they've learned not to ask why. It's called the blank basin. That's not its real name. That's what divers and naval techs started calling it after 1994, when a French deep-sea platform named Thalassa deployed a sonar array that simply vanished. Not broke, not lost. Vanished. The descent log was clear. The platform reached 200 meters without incident. Data was flowing. Then the tether went slack. The cable unspooled, tensionless. When they pulled it up, miles of line came back perfectly intact. But the array at the end was gone. No snap, no burn, no stretch marks. Just gone. As if the platform had been lifted free of the line like a key pulled from a pocket. At the time, they blamed sediment collapse. Maybe a sudden mudslide had buried the unit. Maybe the cable had unwound with just enough resistance to mask the break. But internal reports tell a different story. The very last ping from the sonar was a vertical return. That doesn't happen. Sonar bounces down. It returns from the seafloor or from anomalies below. But the final echo came from above. The equipment pinged, and something directly overhead bounced it back for a second. Then it was gone. Later, dives avoided the spot. Then, in 2002, a satellite picked up a thermal bloom in the same region, a perfect circle of warmer water just half a degree above ambient. It lasted 17 minutes. No plume, no current shift, no surface disturbance. Just a warm pulse in the center of the blank basin. A single exhale. That's when someone began asking questions. A joint research team, German and South African oceanographers, launched a stealth drone to investigate. The drone never made it back, but this time, they got footage. It lasted less than 20 seconds. Most of it is silt, then a flicker of movement. Something long, undulating, but too large to be eel or squid. A slow coil, not near the lens, but in the far left of the screen, hazy and distant, like watching a shadow stretch inside a fogged window. Then something very strange happens. The footage shifts, not in resolution, not from signal loss. The entire frame tilts. Horizons don't exist in deep-sea footage, but even so, you can tell when the frame loses its orientation. the sediment begins to move upward, though the drone hasn't changed depth. That's when the light dies, not gradually, not flickering, like a switch just off. The drone was later recovered, not by the team. It simply surfaced 17 miles south. Tether-burned lights, dead memory mostly intact, except for the final 3 minutes, which were digitally wiped. Again, not corrupted, wiped. One line in the recovery report stands out. Memory deletion signature suggests external electromagnetic interaction, not internal fault. Whatever turned off the drone's eyes was watching it first, and then it returned the body. That's not the action of a predator. That's surgical, deliberate, and somewhere between respectful and territorial. You find other mentions of the blank basin in naval records. In 2011, a submerged signal buoy transmitted a burst pattern of encoded sonar pulses, unprompted, unscheduled. The code matched an experimental ping sequence used by the Soviet Navy in the 1980s. But the buoy wasn't Soviet, and the transmission came from depth. They dismissed it as a prank or an echo from an old wreck until the message repeated. 2 days later, and then again 4 weeks after that. Each time it grew shorter, tighter, as if the sender were learning, adapting the signal, not random, not malfunction. Mimicry. The ocean doesn't do that. Machines do that. Or things that have been listening for a long time. You start seeing the word mirroring in technical logs, not optical, behavioral. A pattern begins to form. Anytime someone sends down light motion or sound into the blank basin, something responds not by revealing itself, but by returning an echo, not a reflection, a version, modified, smaller, sometimes in light, sometimes in sound, sometimes by lifting your equipment gently out of the trench and handing it back. You find a terrifying possibility in the footnotes of an unpublished thesis. What if the trench isn't hiding a creature, but a consciousness? Not one thing. Not alive in the conventional sense, but an ancient reactive intelligence formed by time pressure and silence. Something that learned to mimic as its first form of language. You look at the map again, at the void between islands, at the blank spot on the ocean charts, and you wonder, what if we didn't miss the creature? What if we're looking at it every time we glance at the maps? And what if it's watching us through the drones? We send the sonar. We shout the noise. We make. Not curious, not angry, just aware. And so very, very patient, because the blank basin is empty, but only because something inside it prefers not to be noticed. And the longer you stare into it, the more certain you are it's already staring back. You start thinking about patterns, not numbers, not data points, not just maps and blips and sonar returns. You start thinking about behavior, repetition, motive. Because somewhere along the line, you realize the ocean doesn't just house life, it responds to it. And nowhere is that more unsettling than the Scotia Sea. It's a strange corridor of cold wedged between the tip of South America and Antarctica. Windswept, isolated, the kind of place only icebreakers and storm-chasing vessels dare enter, and even then reluctantly. It's not on shipping lanes. It's not near oil fields. It's just sea and silence. Except it's not. The first hint comes from a drift buoy in 2003, deployed to track glacial melt patterns. Nothing exciting. It floats, it records, it transmits. Then one day, mid-transmission, it stops, not due to a wave, not a battery fault. The final packet of data shows something impossible: downward acceleration. The buoy, floating peacefully on the surface, is suddenly pulled downward at a rate of 4.8 memory S2, roughly half the force of gravity. There is no storm, no sudden hole in the sea. It just sinks. When it's recovered, weeks later, it's found on the shores of South Georgia Island, smashed open, with the steel brackets bent inward like someone or something crushed it from the outside. No creature on record can do that. No natural force leaves behind symmetrical dents. Then it happens again. In 2007, a subsea glider disappears while mapping the shelf. Gone without a trace until sonar scans show a path cut through the benthic layer. A channel 3 meters wide, scoured clean through sediment like a spoon dragged through pudding. That's not a current. That's movement. But here's where it gets stranger. The path ends at a rise, a gentle slope on the sea floor, and then just stops. No burrow, no sign of descent, as if the thing moving simply phased out, or burrowed straight down, leaving no disturbance. Researchers joked about it. They called it the visitor. They didn't laugh for long, because in 2010, acoustic monitoring stations across the Scotia Arc picked up a knock. That's the only word they could agree on. A sharp percussive impact, like stone hitting metal, followed by a reverberation that spanned 270 kilometers. Not loud, not fast, just deliberate. Knock, and 3 minutes later, knock. Identical in tone, amplitude, and delay. Then silence. You play the audio on loop. It doesn't frighten you, not at first. It's just a sound. Low, hollow. But then you hear the spacing. 3 minutes to the second. Over and over. You run the numbers. That's not biological, not tectonic. It's timed. You ask around. A retired geophysicist shows you his field notes from a cruise in the region. We heard it too. Felt it in the soles of our boots. Thought the hull was creaking, but it wasn't inside the ship. It was outside, following. You pause there, and then you remember the sonar contact from 2012, an object moving along the trench wall at 1.8 knots. Not fast, but steady, without changing depth, without rising or falling, as if it was crawling along a ledge you didn't know existed. And when it passed out of sonar range, knock. Again, there's a theory now, unofficial. Some believe the Scotia Sea is home to an ambulatory entity, a deep-sea organism that doesn't swim, but walks. Slowly, methodically, like a living fortress, not with legs, with limbs built for traction. Some even claim it's armored, not because it fights, but because it carries something. That's when the idea forms. What if this thing isn't a predator? What if it's transporting? You revisit the scoured channel. A trail, not a wound. Something moved with intention. Something big. Something that knew where it wanted to go. And what if the knocking is a signal? Not just to announce presence, but to request entry. Entry to what? That's the worst question. Because in the center of that trench, deeper than most modern bathymetry can trace, there's a zone referred to as a shadow basin. That's not poetic. It's literal. A place sonar refuses to penetrate. It's not that it returns empty. It returns falsely. The readings bounce back wrong, distorted, as if they pass through more than one layer of material. The only comparison, hollow stone or bone. You stop asking questions. You just stare at the contour lines, the way they fold inward, the way that zone never quite gets filled in. A marine acoustician calls it a reverberation pocket, a chamber that rings like a bell whenever sound touches it. But he doesn't explain what makes the walls. And no one's been able to measure the bottom, because no equipment lasts more than 18 minutes. They don't explode. They don't fail. They just stop transmitting. And 3 minutes after each dive ends, you guessed it, knock. There's one last entry in a private dive team's journal. Unauthorized, unsanctioned, just 3 people in a rented vessel with more courage than budget. They dropped a probe. A simple one. No camera. Just audio. The final recording. Breathing. Not wind. Not bubbles. Breathing. Steady. Enormous. Rhythmic. And just before the probe goes silent, knock. The journal ends there. You sit with the idea for a long time. Something moves through the Scotia Sea. It does not chase. It does not flee. It knocks, like it's waiting for someone to answer. And someday, maybe soon, we will. And what do you say when something that lives in silence finally gets let in? You think the Mariana Trench would have made its grandest appearance already. It's the deepest spot on Earth. The pressure is staggering. The darkness is total. Nearly 7 miles down, it's where all the headlines start, and all the old sea legends seem to end. Except they don't, because somewhere near the southern end, past Challenger Deep, past Sirena Deep, there's a point that doesn't make sense. You hear about it from a technician stationed on the Shinkai, a Japanese survey vessel. He calls it the shelf that wasn't there. Here's how it begins. They were scanning for slope collapses, small landslides that help scientists understand how the trench wall is eroding. Nothing dramatic, just slow geology. They'd done this pass before dozens of times, but this time something had changed. An entire shelf was missing, not just a layer of rock, a formation the size of a football field. Gone, replaced by a perfectly smooth, vertical wall, as if something had carved straight down and lifted the seabed out like slicing a piece of cake. Impossible, the geologists said. There's no tectonic event that sharp, that silent. No known landslide that neat. And then they found the indentations, 6 of them, evenly spaced, rounded, not sharp like claws, not cracked like quake scars, pressed. Each was about 5 meters across, pressed into the sediment like a footprint, but not a foot. A pad. Something set itself down, then pushed off. Whatever it was, it didn't fall. It landed, and then it left. And here's where it gets worse. The sonar picked up residual heat. A faint warmth barely above ambient leaking from the impressions. Sea floor doesn't hold heat like that, unless it was warmed by something massive. Recently, and then came the static. Every time the sonar passed over the indentations, the feedback loop began to build a distortion, not in the signal, but in the operator's headphones. Like a whine, but not audible to everyone, only to those listening directly. 2 operators reported headaches. One described feeling like someone was brushing my brain with metal. Another heard something else, a voice, not in language, not in words, just something speaking directly in sensation, like a shape being transmitted, not sound. He drew it later. It looked like a spiral with 7 branches, each curling inward, ending in what resembled antennae. He didn't remember drawing it, so they checked the signal log, and buried inside the spectrogram was a near match, a waveform forming the same spiral pattern, not just sound anymore. Now shape embedded in vibration. No one wanted to call it a message, so they didn't. They called it interference. You dig into historical records. The same area was avoided during the first U.S. bathyscaphe dives in the 1960s. In one log, a diver mentions feeling watched and notes that the submersible lights dimmed near the shelf wall only in that zone. No one returned to the site for 40 years, until 2004. when a NOAA mapping project accidentally passed over it. The ROV caught something strange. No creature, just a hole, not a fissure, not a vent. A tunnel perfectly circular 5 meters wide, vanishing straight into the trench wall. No heat, no chemical trace, no outward flow. Just a dark open cylinder bored through rock like butter. It went in 80 meters, then the camera failed. The unit was retrieved days later, all intact, except the lens was gone, not broken, removed, unscrewed from inside the housing, and left floating next to the unit like it had been set aside. That footage never aired. The operation was listed as incomplete due to low visibility, but the notes survive, and the final entry from the pilot reads, "It wasn't a cave. It was a doorway, and it was open." You try to dismiss it. Try. But the spiral image comes back to you. The shape drawn without memory. The heat, the indentation. And then you find the last clue. In 2020, a Chinese bathymetric survey drone went silent near that same shelf. When recovered, its hull bore scratches, thin spiral markings running up from the base to the tip. Not from collision, not from current, from touch, as if something coiled around it. Not to destroy, to feel it, to read it. And just like the previous case, the drone's memory was erased, except for one file, a single still image, almost black, but in the center, the faintest glow of blue, and in the glow, a spiral form, floating, not attached to anything, not glowing from light, but from response. You run the image filter. The spiral pulses once, then vanishes, almost as if it had been waiting to be recognized, like a biological QR code, a trigger, a beacon. You stare at the map of the trench. You overlay every event, every heat bloom, every sonar glitch, every erased drone memory, every drawn spiral, and you see it, not chaos, a circle. The incidents form a perimeter, a slow, careful edge around a zone no one has successfully entered, not because they weren't curious, but because something there wants you to stay just far enough away, close enough to be seen, but not close enough to understand. You sit with that. The idea that the deepest part of Earth isn't hiding something monstrous, but something sentient and waiting, not to feed, but to communicate. And all we've ever done is knock too lightly to be heard, or just loudly enough to be told we're not ready. There are no voices in the deep, at least not the kind you understand. But in 2015, off the coast of Western Australia, something answered a question no one asked. You've read the report, short clinical, like someone trying very hard not to sound afraid. A research vessel was laying down a hydrophone array, part of a global climate initiative to monitor sound propagation across the Indian Ocean. The equipment was standard, the layout familiar. They dropped 6 nodes in a staggered pattern, each calibrated to listen for specific frequency ranges, mostly cetacean traffic seismic shifts and shipping lane interference. But one of them, node 4, heard something else. It didn't arrive all at once. It built itself. The technicians called it the climb. It began as a tone barely audible low and directionless. Then slowly, over the course of 6 minutes, the frequency rose. Not like a whale call, not a musical scale. This was mathematical. The tone climbed in perfect logarithmic intervals, stepping upward at rates no known animal produces. Each frequency shift was precise down to the decimal. It was a pattern, and it reached 38.4 hertz before stopping abruptly. That's where it got strange. At that exact moment, node 260, nautical miles away, picked up a mirror climb, but in reverse. Starting at 38.4 hertz and descending perfectly. And when both tones stopped, there was silence. Not ocean silence, dead silence. No current noise, no fish chatter, no distant whale song. The sea just paused for 3 minutes. Then normal activity resumed. The audio went public, briefly just long enough for amateur analysts to pick it apart. You find their forums buried beneath pages of sonar theory and open source software logs. And their one user says something that sticks. It's not a sound, it's a handshake. He's right. The frequencies aren't just tonal. They follow an ancient structure, Fibonacci sequence intervals mapped onto audio form. Nature's spiral, heard instead of seen. And the climb. It's not speech, it's syntax, language without letters, thought without words. The ocean speaking in structure. Node 4's hardware was later found to be magnetized, not fried, not shorted, magnetized like it had passed through a field strong enough to align its internal components. Node 2 was found corroded with microabrasions shaped like hexagonal ridges. That doesn't happen naturally. That's contact. No animals were sighted during the transmission. No vessels nearby. No seafloor activity logged. Just a signal. Two frequencies meeting halfway, and the ocean holding its breath to listen. You look back at other sound maps. The bloop, Julia, upsweep, train. The famous unknowns of underwater acoustics. What if they weren't accidents? What if they were attempts? Early drafts of contact. First signals from something that doesn't speak in vocal cords or syllables. Something that builds meaning the way coral builds reef, layer by layer, sound by sound, waiting for someone to recognize the shape of the message. And we never did. Until the climb. Until the structure aligned. One Australian researcher who left the project soon after published an anonymous PDF titled Nested Syntax in Abyssal Frequency Events. In it, he proposes a radical idea that deep ocean signals operate like syntax trees, with bass tones forming roots and frequency shifts representing emotional inflection. You want to laugh. Then you remember how humpback whales change their songs every season. You remember how cephalopods change the colors of their skin to mimic syntax and silence. You remember that dolphins name each other, and you stop laughing. Because maybe communication doesn't always sound like talking. Maybe sometimes it sounds like climbing, then falling, then silence. Not because the message failed, but because the answer was given. You go back to Node 4's coordinates. Beneath that section of ocean is a shelf, not deep, not special, just a flat plane of sediment. Except there's one anomaly, a ridge they called it, but ridges don't hum. Sonar showed a standing wave pattern, not seismic, but acoustic, hovering over the ridge like a crown. It didn't move, didn't fade, just pulsed. Every 4 minutes, matching the tail interval of the climb, they sent a drone. It got within 20 meters before all systems shut down. It returned to the surface on backup floaters, memory blank. But someone managed to run a low-frequency scan before the shutdown. It revealed a structure, not rock, not life, something in between, layered, repeating, like shell, or chitin, or architecture. And underneath it, a cavity, hollow, sound absorbent. The report is redacted, but in a leaked image, you see the outline of the formation. It's curved. It looks like a listening dish, not transmitting, receiving, waiting, and maybe building replies. You don't know what left it there. You don't know if it's still active. But you do know this. The climb wasn't noise. It was an opening sentence. And in the silence afterward, something answered. You begin to think the ocean doesn't just house secrets, it accumulates them. Like it's collecting, curating, maybe even preserving things that don't belong anywhere else. Not just life forms, but ideas. Concepts too large for surface minds. behaviors too alien for land-based logic. And in the South China Sea, near a stretch of water known for storms and silence, there is one secret you almost wish had stayed buried. It starts with a wreck, not ancient, not wooden. A research vessel, Chinese, unnamed in official documents, but nicknamed the Widow by its own crew. Deployed in 2006 to investigate a magnetic anomaly at the edge of the Spratly Islands, they were testing deep-sea magnetometers tools meant to map the Earth's crust and predict quake zones. But the readings were erratic. Not just spikes, but shifts like something below was turning, slowly altering the field in rhythm. They dropped a ROV with dual-lens optics pressure rated to 6,000 meters. What they found made it 14 minutes into the dive. What they lost happened in the 15th. You've seen the fragment footage. The ROV descends through relatively clear water. Silt clouds drift lazily. There's no trench, no volcanic ridge, nothing dramatic. Then at 482 meters, the video starts to wobble, not from current, from space. The geometry of the seafloor warps, not visibly, but in layout-like angles no longer obey the rules. The rocks curve, but they don't converge. The sediment slopes downward, then sideways, then down again, and then the signal distorts, not cuts, repeats. A 3-second clip plays twice, then again backward, then jumps forward 12 seconds. Something in the field is replaying the past. The final shot before blackout is this, a monolithic form. Not animal, not rock, rising slightly out of the silt. It's smooth, tall, not massive, but deliberate. And it has edges, too clean, too vertical. Like someone carved it using tools we don't have. And then the feed dies. The ROV never returns. The Widow surfaces a day later, missing half its crew. No damage to the hull, no water breach, just missing people. 3 scientists, 1 diver, and 1 communications officer. Gone. The survivors don't speak at all. The official report calls it stress-induced aphasia, but the logs tell another story. One man wrote something before he vanished. A single sentence scrawled into a notebook and torn out. It wasn't built here. You start looking deeper. Other vessels have logged disturbances in the region. Magnetic pulses that crash compass systems. Biological confusion among fish and whales. One pilot fish was recorded spinning in tight, endless circles for 43 minutes before dying. A deep-sea drone deployed in 2012 caught something faint, a hum, not a drone noise, not machinery, something internal, organic, like wind blowing through a hollow shell, except at 5,000 meters, with no current and no passage. The hum lasted 38 minutes, then reversed itself. Same tone, same pitch, played backward perfectly. That's not an echo, that's intention. A pattern emerges. Every 5 to 7 years, something pulls equipment toward this one spot. Drones go off course. Sonar bends inward. Submarines drift without current. It's not gravity, it's memory. Somewhere beneath that silt, something is remembering you. And if that sounds insane, consider this. In 2021, a classified dive placed a pressure-sensitive acoustic sensor at the same coordinates. It was designed not to send data, but to react, to wait for a trigger. It activated 3 times in 1 week. Each time it detected a heat bloom, a tone descending from 43 hertz to 19 hertz, and then a voice, or something close to a voice, a multi-frequency waveform approximating phonetic structure, not in any known language, not even human structure, but it repeats. And the shape of the sound, the pitch curves, matches patterns in known linguistic inflection. In other words, it wasn't random. It was speaking, or maybe worse, it was recording us. Because the last transmission wasn't a word. It was an echo of the dive crew's own radio chatter, replayed, shifted, mimicked. You've read this story before, but not in scientific journals, in folklore, in the legends of the mimic below, tales from Filipino fishermen who swear they've heard their own names whispered from the sea even when alone. In ancient Chinese texts that refer to Haimo the sea memory, a creature said to listen, wait, and copy. And when it has copied enough, it speaks in your voice with your words, but never quite right. One diver recounted hearing his own distress call before he made it, recorded in advance, played back like a warning or a test. You consider the structure again, the monolith, the playback, the reversed tones. What if it's not just a creature? What if it's an archive, not built by us, not meant for us, but triggered by us? And once triggered, it doesn't attack, it doesn't flee, it learns. And maybe that's worse, because now, somewhere beneath the silt of the South China Sea, something knows your words, your signals, your sounds, and maybe your thoughts. You stop digging, you stop asking questions, but the mimic, it doesn't stop, because somewhere in the dark, it's still listening, and it's getting better. You hear about the last dive of the Astridin Whispers, not news, not science, just scattered fragments in forums and message boards, like someone trying to piece together a dream they don't want to remember. The Astrid was a private research vessel, European flagged, but funded by a Norwegian tech group you can't find in any public registry. The crew was small, minimal. 5 researchers, 2 pilots, and a submersible known only as Lumen. The goal, they said, was to test deep environment optics, new sensors meant to cut through particulate and haze in mid-depth zones. But the Astrid didn't launch near the coast. It went to the Sunda Trench, one of the deepest points in the Indian Ocean, a place riddled with seismic ghosts and sonar dead zones. A place the ocean seems to press down on harder than it should. Not just with water, but with intention. The dive began like any other. Lumen descended, cleanly drifted downward with the current, and began transmitting. For 20 minutes, the footage was textbook dark blue, slipping to black, drifting clouds of sediment, bioluminescent flickers blinking like lazy stars. Then the glow. It began faintly, a soft shimmer rising from below, not from above. Not like a vent, not like plankton. This was too uniform, too controlled. The glow didn't flicker, it breathed, pulsing every 10 seconds, dimming, then returning a heartbeat written in light. The pilot asked if there was another sub in the area. There wasn't. At 80 meters, the sub reached a shelf, an unnatural-looking one, too flat, too level. And at the center of that shelf, something sat. Not rock, not coral, a circle. Perfect. Etched into the seafloor. Not recent, worn with time, but unmistakably symmetrical. 10 meters across, shallowly carved a spiral, surrounded by wedge shapes like rays of a stylized sun. The lumen drifted closer, and then the light responded. It brightened. Once, briefly, then went out. The spiral didn't. In fact, it seemed to deepen. Not in depth, but in focus. Like the longer you stared, the more it shifted toward clarity. As if the sea were pulling it into view only for you. The pilot reported a sense of extreme attention, not from the crew, from the trench. Then the sonar broke. Not failed, reversed. It began recording echoes before pings. Sounds were returning before they were made, like the signal was being predicted. You think about that for too long. Still, the crew pushed forward. A final maneuver was planned, a full perimeter scan of the shelf. That's when it happened. The sub's internal pressure gauge began to rise, slowly, without any change in depth, as if the surrounding water had become heavier. The hull groaned a sound no one wants to hear that deep. The pilot pulled back. Too late. The sub tilted. Not from current, not from impact, from pull. Something was beneath them. No shape, no sudden lunge. Just a slow, spiraling drag downward. The team hit ballast release. The sub rose 10 meters. The pull increased. Then the spiral on the floor began to glow. Not all at once, piece by piece, segment by segment, as if reacting, not in threat, in recognition. That's when the pilot made the final call: cut. Tether, initiate emergency ascent. But the signal was already gone. Topside. The Astrid watched the last telemetry blink out one by one. Not fail. Deactivate. Calmly, with no errors. The sub never surfaced. The team was declared lost. But 10 days later, something washed ashore on the Cocos Islands. Not a body, not debris. A black box, unlabeled, encrypted, but inside a single file. Video, 16 seconds, mostly noise and static. But in the final 3 seconds, the screen clears. The spiral is visible again. Only this time, it isn't carved into stone. It's open, hovering above the seafloor made of light. A spinning three-dimensional lattice with folds and curls and shifting geometry that bends the camera's perspective in ways your brain resists. And at its center, for less than 1 second, a shape appears. A figure, not humanoid, not monstrous, just wrong, too smooth, too still, not lit by the spiral, emitting it. Then the feed ends. The Astrid never sailed again. The backers vanished. The incident faded into rumor. You go back to the coordinates. Others have tried to return. Their logs are short. Equipment failure, compass reversal, pressure anomalies. One drone was found spiraling upward at 2 knots, engines inactive, as if something had returned it, untouched, just confused. One final note appears in a technician's journal. The spiral wasn't a symbol, it was a doorbell. And we rang it. You stop reading, you don't sleep well, because somewhere beneath the Sunda trench, something exists that doesn't lure. It listens, and when it's heard enough, it might start to reply. In geometry, in gravity, in shape, and silence, and shimmer. And the reply may not be words. It may just be an invitation. You wouldn't think the North Sea had secrets. It's shallow, busy European. More known for fishing and oil rigs than mystery. It's been mapped, drilled, monitored every inch, sliced into economic zones and shipping lanes. Not deep enough for monsters. Not remote enough for myth. But then came the ringing. At first, it was dismissed, just another sound in a loud ocean. A background tone. A hum. Something the hydrophones picked up that wasn't worth logging. Maybe ship engines bouncing across thermoclines. Maybe refraction from seismic surveys, except it kept returning. And it came with patterns, 12 minutes past the hour, every hour, on the dot. You hear about it from a marine biologist working a noise pollution study. He thought it was industrial, at first sonar pings overlapping. Then he slowed the recording down. The pulse wasn't mechanical. It had decay, natural reverb, like a struck bell ringing through pressure and water. It lasted 7 seconds, faded, and returned again. 12 minutes later, always 12, always from the same depth. You track the sound to a region off the Dogger Bank, a raised seabed plateau, famous for ancient human settlements, now drowned beneath the waves. In the Stone Age, this was Doggerland dry ground full of rivers and hunters. Now it's just current. And the ringing. One group thought it was leftover sonar from a buried munitions dump. Another blamed wreckage World War II steel warped by shifting sediment. But no one could explain the precision. The ringing didn't drift. It didn't warp with the tide. It stayed anchored in frequency, every 720 seconds. Exactly. So they sent a probe, a basic hydrophone payload with pressure sensors and passive sonar. It lasted 36 minutes. Then something shut it off. No damage, no flood, just silence. When recovered, its time code was wrong. Not just missing, reversed, as if the clock had run backward. The logs say hardware error, but the engineering notes quietly ask, why did the GPS show negative drift? Because GPS doesn't do that. Unless time itself was altered, you find whispers of other probes. One came back with its SD card melted into the board. Another with audio files that were scrambled, not corrupted, but reordered. When played, the files didn't make sense, until one scientist reorganized them by pitch instead of timestamp. And suddenly, a melody emerged. 4 tones, rising, repeating, like a chime. You start calling it the clockwork bell. It's not the only one. Older seismic data shows similar pulses near the Orkney Trench in 1988. Then again, in 2001, 2015, and most recently in 2023. Each time 12 minutes apart. Each time the pulse ends with a harmonic decay, a soft trailing tone like metal cooling after a strike. And each time, nothing is found. But people hear it. Divers, crews, oil rig engineers. One North Sea worker reports waking every night at 12 minutes past the hour, sweating ears ringing dreams full of pale circles. Another says the deck plates hum beneath his boots. They try to laugh it off, until the data shows the rig's foundation has begun to sink. Not suddenly, slowly, precisely, 12 centimeters every 12 hours. That's not erosion, that's timed. One log entry calls it a pressure anomaly. Another just says it's drawing us in. Then you find the dive report, unofficial. 2 researchers, a borrowed ROV, no permits. They reached 156 meters before visibility collapsed. Not from silt, from refraction. Light started bending the wrong way, angling upward even though the ROV still descended. Then a shape appeared, round, flat, embedded in the seabed like a manhole. They called it a hatch. It pulsed once, then the water stopped moving. No current, no pressure change, no sound, just pause. The diver above panicked. The ROV lost buoyancy and began to fall. Not fast, not like a break. Just as if gravity had shifted. Then the tether snapped, and for 3 minutes, every recording device on the surface went silent. Not static, not noise, silence. Like someone had muted reality. When the ROV reappeared on the sonar, 18 minutes later, it was rising again. Upright, unaffected, except the lens cap was missing. Removed, carefully unscrewed. No damage, just gone. As if something had looked back. You remember the pulses, the time, the way every artifact obeyed the same interval. You begin to think, it's not a bell, it's a clock, a machine of unknown scale buried beneath centuries of silt, still ticking in perfect rhythm. And not because it wants to be found, but because it can't stop. Something started it once, long ago, maybe before Doggerland sank, before the flood, before us. A mechanism, a memory, and now it counts down in the dark. No alarms, No warnings. Just one soft ring every 12 minutes. Waiting, measuring. And when the hour finally arrives, maybe it won't ring anymore. Maybe it will open. Some stories never get told because they never officially happened. That's the case with Operation Pale Drift, a Cold War naval deployment buried so deep in classified files that even its code name feels like misdirection. You don't find it in declassified Soviet archives or forgotten US communiques. You find it in the margins, in quiet confessions from submarine techs who stopped sleeping well, in secondhand bar stories from dive medics who swore they heard whispers inside their suits, in documents so thoroughly redacted they might as well be blank except for one detail that always escapes the censors. Longitude 74,34 carcass d. E latitude 57 de N. The Sea of Okhotsk, Northern Pacific, ringed by volcanic arcs and glacial runoff. Shallow in some places, impossibly deep in others. The sort of place where radar loses clarity, sonar echoes twice, and icebergs vanish without melting. The mission was simple monitor submarine movement through the Kuril Islands and drop automated sonar buoys across a channel suspected of hiding Soviet deployments. But when the first buoy was dropped, it immediately sank too fast, as if something had pulled it down, not cut the line, not broken the winch, drawn it. You expect malfunction. You expect a snapped cable or a busted connector. But the team dropped a second buoy, and this one recorded laughter, not human, not mocking, just wrong. A pattern of sounds resembling breath through water, spaced with rhythmic pauses. The signal wasn't voice per se, more like wet exhalations, distorted into something that wanted to sound human, but wasn't built for it. It laughed once, then silence. They pulled the buoy up. The casing was scarred, not burned, not clawed, etched. Circular grooves and concentric rings, not damage, not accident. Writing. No one could translate it. The mission continued, though unease began to spread. 2 nights later, the sub Artemis went missing. It wasn't far. Just a routine dive into a canyon shelf no one had mapped yet. The team was mapping underwater mineral flows. The last transmission was garbled something about a curtain opening, and then nothing. The sub was found hours later, floating, empty, no damage, no breach, hatches sealed, just no crew, all 5 gone. The only trace, a smear of ash on the interior walls, black, dry, odorless, clinging like dust. Under blacklight, it glowed faint blue, and it was warm for 6 days. There's a term in the log's wet shadows, used by divers who reported seeing human-shaped masses drift past their external lights at depth not swimming, just hovering, upright, still. One diver tried to chase one. He never resurfaced. His tether return knotted into a spiral. The mission was scrubbed, but some stayed behind, not out of duty, out of obsession. They had seen something, or maybe heard something, because at exactly AO3:13 local time every night for 4 consecutive days, a deep thrum echoed through the water, each night louder than the last. Not sonar, not a whale, something deeper. The sound mimicked breathing, but not steady, not natural, like something learning how to do it. And on the 5th night, it stopped. That's when the frost appeared, not on the outside of the ship, on the inside. The control panels, the handrails, even inside pressurized compartments, all coated with a thin film of ice. And when they checked external temperatures, it was rising. The water outside had warmed by 8 degrees, so the cold didn't come from the sea. It came from inside the vessel. A team of technicians evacuated. 3 didn't make it. Their last known locations were near the sonar deck, and the sonar deck was covered in mud. Not seawater, not spray, mud. As if something had walked through it step by step and left no other trace. You piece together the testimonies. What emerges is less a mission and more a ritual. One technician claims he dreamed of a mouth, not with teeth but with windows. A mouth shaped like a corridor. He walked through it. When he woke, he was clutching a piece of seaweed. No one had opened his chamber. You revisit the coordinates. In modern data sets, that point is still flagged. Not restricted, not dangerous, just flagged. The bathymetry there is warped, distorted like a funhouse mirror. One researcher describes it as a void that's actively incorrect. When you ping it with sonar, the signal returns before you send it. And when you try to send light, the water bends it, just slightly, just enough to make you question what's really down there. A 2010 Kaiwanyi expedition accidentally crossed into the same trench. They reported a metallic taste in their mouths. No chemical trace, no damage. But for 12 hours, their speech became delayed. The recordings show each person speaking out loud, but their voice only plays back 3 seconds later. No cause. The mics were analog. The captain logged it as auditory drift. Then the crew began forgetting things. Not slowly, suddenly. One man forgot his name. Another couldn't remember how they arrived. A third simply stared at the water for hours repeating, "It wants to be heard." They left. They never came back. But the coordinates still echo. If you drop a hydrophone, there now, even today, and listen long enough, you might still hear it. Not words, not warning, just that same breath through water. Almost human, almost laughter. And if you listen too long, it remembers you. Because some places weren't carved by nature. They were invited. Places where silence learns to wear a face and waits just beneath the surface. The first time you hear about the 11th current, you think it's a joke. Oceanographers name things all the time. Eddies gyres, microcurrents, and they often sound like abstract paintings. But this one shows up in too many reports, with too few explanations. It's always mentioned sideways, in the footnotes, beneath the real data, and it's always described the same way. An unmodeled current appears at depth flows against prevailing pressure gradients and then disappears. No start point, no consistent direction, no source, just motion. An invisible hand pushing through water where it shouldn't be able to. In 2008, a British ship trailing data cables near the mid-Atlantic ridge encountered it for the first time. The current drifted in from below, rising diagonally at 2 knots. It pushed the cable upward, lifting nearly 80 meters of slack, and then vanished. Sensors recorded a pressure inversion, a momentary reversal of gravitational drag, as if the water wasn't pushing upward, but something beneath it was pulling. 3 hours later, a whale carcass floated to the surface 40 miles away. There were no wounds, no scavenging, just missing weight. The blubber layer had collapsed inward, like it had been emptied from within. The report said bacterial gas release, but that doesn't turn mussel to jelly. You look into other sightings. In 1994, a French deep-sea cable snapped, not torn, not cut, but softened. The steel fibers had been reshaped as if by extreme heat, but with no increase in temperature recorded on the sensors. Instead, they all logged one strange spike. A magnetic bloom, lasted 14 seconds, origin unknown, and always, the 11th current follows. It appears in the aftermath, or sometimes just before. A shift in flow, a hesitation in the water, like the ocean is about to change direction, but can't quite decide why. Then, there's the dive off the Azores. Unmanned routine. The sub was running a course along a mid-level ridge. when the current arrived horizontal 1.2 knots directly against the natural flow of the region. Not fast, but insistent. It pushed the sub off course. Then the cameras caught something. Not a creature, not movement, a crease in the water, like you might see in fabric, like the ocean itself had folded. It shimmered once, then snapped back. The current was gone, but so was the trench below it. No longer there, like someone had turned the page. The footage cuts out. The dive ends. You dismiss it as optical illusion until you find a similar report from 2017, this time from a Chinese vessel scanning near the 90 East Ridge. Same anomaly, same current, same fold. And this time, the crew experienced vertigo inside the ship, anchored, stable, but every crew member reported nausea, disorientation, even spatial confusion. One man insisted the corridor was now angled wrong. And here's the strange part. The compass readings had shifted by 1.3 degrees, just for a moment, then back. That shouldn't happen. That doesn't happen unless your frame of reference has changed, unless the sea itself is tilting. The 11th current has no source, no beginning. It moves through oceans like a phantom tide, rising from nowhere, pushing, nudging, whispering, and then evaporating. No sediment shift, no salinity change, no thermal rise, just pressure, just motion, like something huge below the map is repositioning itself. Or maybe it's not one thing. Maybe it's space itself adjusting. There's a theory buried deep in fringe physics journals that the sea can be torn like paper under just the right conditions. Gravity, magnetism, water, density. A fault line not of rock, but of reality, a rift. The 11th current then isn't water. It's flow between places. You go back to the data. One by one, you reanalyze each current spike, and something chilling emerges. The path always curves, never a straight line, always an arc, like an orbit or a limb. You map them each appearance of the current, and the curve closes. It's not a random pattern, it's circular. And the center, somewhere deep in the South Atlantic, near the Sandwich Trench, a place no one visits, because every dive there ends with the same three things: magnetic interference, directional confusion, the sound of wind where no wind should be. That's the final clue. The 11th current isn't pushing water. It's dragging something beneath it, something slow. Colossal, not a creature, a structure, one that's not bound to seafloor or tectonics, one that moves slowly, in loops passing beneath us every few years. It doesn't surface. It doesn't announce itself. It just shifts beneath our feet, and when it does, the water obeys. It curves, it pulls, it makes room, because the 11th current is not a current. It's awake, and something is passing by, something large enough to disturb the entire sea without ever being seen. If you chart all the anomalies, the magnetic spikes, sonar interruptions, drifting buoys, vanishing signals, you find something odd, not in their shape, in their spacing. They're evenly distributed, not perfectly, not mathematically exact, but consistent, like teeth on a gear or buoys on a net. Every few hundred miles, another disturbance, another unexplained silence, another strange return. They're not clustered, they're positioned. You think back to what the technician said about the 11th current, about space folding, about wake patterns and rifts, about things too large and too old to move like animals, too careful to leave trails. And you begin to wonder, what if the ocean doesn't just hide things? What if it houses them, not like an aquarium, like a library, an archive, a place where something has left markers? And once you start seeing them, you can't stop. A strange circular formation, off the coast of Greenland. Unexplained pillars near the Congo Deep. A depression in the Peru Basin that forms a perfect ring. No silt, no rockfall, no sign of tectonic origin. And then there's the data. A thermal satellite scan from 2009 showed a wave of heat moving across the ocean floor between Australia and the South Pacific. Not volcanic, not solar, internal. It moved too slowly to be current, too steadily to be natural, and it matched the path of 5 major marine anomalies recorded over the past 20 years. It wasn't a wave, it was a wake, as if something passed beneath the crust and the earth exhaled. Then someone found the glyphs. Yes, glyphs, not letters, not carvings, just patterns. Geometric shapes imprinted on mineral nodules recovered from deep-sea dredging. Always the same design. 3 crescents, 1 spiral, and a mark like an eye split down the center. They're not language. They're tags, location markers, warnings maybe, or permissions. And they've appeared on opposite sides of the planet in the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, the Philippine Basin. Every site matched with strange readings, pressure drops, echo delays, sensor failure, and always the same shape, as if someone or something is claiming territory. You stumble across a term in an old UN naval report. Anchor points, mentioned only once, no context, but the surrounding data is chilling. Each anchor point is a place where seafloor magnetic alignment shifts against the Earth's field. Local currents drift counter to prevailing flow. Deep fauna vanish entirely from sonar records. Not just move away, vanish, as though something below has signaled them to leave, or eaten the signal, or replaced it. You read further. There are 13 anchor points, every continent bordered by at least one. All deep, all quiet, all avoided. One scientist calls them lung zones, where the ocean seems to inhale and exhale on multi-decade rhythms. Another calls them locks, and that's when it hits you. What if the ocean is sealed? What if something was put down there, not just to sleep, not just to wait, but to be locked away? And now the locks are loosening, not fast, not violently, just one by one. Like rusted bolts turning after centuries of stillness. You return to the spiral, the sound patterns, the glow from the trench, the mimic voice, the grid of lights that flared once, then disappeared. They weren't glitches. They were tests, pulses, codes, coordinates, behaviors, meant to activate something else, or maybe just check if the world above was ready to receive. What would an intelligence do if it didn't want to be seen? It would wait, learn your language, learn your light, adapt to your sensors, and then leave breadcrumbs, little moments that don't make sense, just enough to tease the curious, just enough to shape belief, so that when the real thing comes, you'll already be listening, already tuned to the right frequency, already prepared to answer. But here's the terrifying part. What if you're not being invited? What if it's not a call? What if it's a warning? Not come, but don't. Not join us, but stay back. Because maybe what's down there isn't trying to escape. Maybe it's trying to hold something else in. And all these signals, all these strange events, a system fraying at the edges, one warning at a time. You look back at the anomalies, the missing probes, the shattered sound, the shapes seen in darkness. They all start to look like cracks in something old, cracks in something built to last longer than memory, something someone left behind, because they knew one day we'd listen too closely, drill too deep, ping too loud, and the things locked beneath would start to stir. Not out of hunger, not out of anger, but because the door's been touched too many times, and eventually, even a forgotten god might start to wonder, who's knocking? You've heard of the Hadal zone. It's the deepest part of the ocean, trenches mostly places where the pressure could crush steel, where light hasn't touched in hundreds of millions of years, where life isn't supposed to exist, but does. Worms, amphipods, strange jellyfish that pulse in the silence. But what you've never heard of is the Zeta Zone. It's not on any marine chart. It's not in textbooks. It's a term whispered among deep-sea researchers who've been around too long and seen too much. A joke at first, next stop the Zeta Zone. Haha. But the longer they stare into those black displays and measure inexplicable readings, the less they laugh. You hear about it from a grizzled bathymetry technician who left his post mid-expedition citing topological contradictions. Contradictions? Like what? Like this, a trench that extends downward for miles, but whose walls are curved outward. Or a space that seems wider from the inside than from any sonar pass. One ROV sent to a target location returned footage of a canyon that wasn't supposed to exist. Not a miscalculation, not a drift. A whole other structure, somewhere within the Puerto Rico Trench. And then it disappeared again. The ROV couldn't find it on its second pass. The camera showed only sediment. No rock, no wall, no entrance, nothing. It's as if the structure folded back into the seafloor. Not collapsed, receded. That's when the idea of the Zeta Zone begins to take shape, not as a place, but a condition. A region where space behaves abnormally, where depth does not equal pressure, where light curves without current, where the laws of geology begin to glitch, a space that resists being mapped. One team from Denmark unofficially labeled such an area as gravity negative. They meant it literally. A probe descended, and instead of acceleration, its speed slowed. Drag didn't explain it, nor did friction. The math simply stopped working. Another theory followed. What if the Zeta Zone is not a physical trench, but an imprint, a place not carved by tectonics, but by some past presence, massive, deliberate, and long since gone. A kind of scar on the ocean floor, one that tries to close itself, and if something enters, the scar remembers. There's a deep-sea drone called Kite 12 that went missing in 2016, only to be recovered 3 years later, off-course, unsignaled, floating in the Southern Ocean. Still intact, still powered, and the memory logs, empty, except for one folder, a single looping video file 38 seconds long. Frame 1 shows nothing but darkness. Then a flare, white light not from the drone. It pulses from somewhere outside. Once, then again. 5 times, in a pattern. Dot, dot, dash, dash, dot. You check the code. It spells Z. You play the rest of the footage. Something passes in front of the camera. Silhouetted. Large. Smooth. No details. No motion blur. But it leaves behind a trail of flickering light, like the wake of a jellyfish, except vertical. A signature, and then nothing. The drone shuts off. How did it end up in the Southern Ocean? No one knows. Kite 12 had no propulsion, powerful enough to travel thousands of kilometers on its own. The only answer is that something moved it, or something followed it and left it where we'd find it. Like a message, you start seeing the symbol in other places. Cave walls in Papua New Guinea, 3 diagonal lines with a curve beneath. An old sailor's log from the 1800s, a crude drawing of a tentacled creature with a circle on its chest. Inside the circle, the letter Z. Even in ancient Norse scrollwork, what was once thought to be ornamental swirl now resembles a spiral ending in a cross stroke, not decoration. Designation. Maybe the Zeta Zone has been known longer than we think. Maybe it's not just a hole, it's a threshold. And the things behind it, they don't like being cataloged. One more case appears. A private expedition near the Java Trench, funded by a tech billionaire, the kind of operation that doesn't get reported until something goes wrong, which it did. The submersible lost power for 17 minutes. When it re-emerged, both pilots were alive, but disoriented, confused. One was clutching a sketch pad, on it a series of arcs and loops. Over and over, the same symbol, not spirals, not randomness. It was the Zeta glyph. They hadn't seen it before, hadn't heard of it, but both had dreamed of it during the blackout. They remembered nothing else, just the symbol. One repeated phrase was found on the sub's internal audio, whispered over and over by one of the crew. It folds inward. It folds inward. It folds inward. A week later, both pilots resigned. One vanished entirely. The other refused to enter water deeper than a bathtub. You talk to a physicist who specializes in geospatial anomalies. She tells you cautiously, the Zeta Zone might be the ocean's way of forgetting or remembering something we shouldn't. You ask what that means. She doesn't answer. She just stares at the map, then circles 3 locations: the Mariana Trench, the Kermadec Trench, and the Peruchili Trench. Each has seen Zeta-level anomalies. Each has swallowed expeditions whole. Each has returned something different than what went in. Not monsters, not answers, but messages, in silence, in reverse coordinates, in sonar glitches shaped like eyes. You begin to think the ocean isn't just deep, it's layered, and we're swimming on the skin of something far older, something that doesn't see us as invaders, but as echoes, as the static left behind by a voice that once spoke from below, and now in some dark corners is beginning to speak again. You're not supposed to find this signal. It isn't on any marine frequency. It doesn't travel like a wave. It isn't broadcast through traditional means. It's embedded, hidden inside background noise tucked between sonar returns, folded into the static between undersea cables. But once you see it, once you hear it, it never goes away. It's called the whisper line. The first time it's detected, it's by accident an audio engineer in New Zealand running compression tests on deep-sea recordings from the Kermadec Trench. While scrubbing low-bandwidth hum from a sample, he notices a harmonic that shouldn't be there. Faint, delicate, but rhythmic. He boosts the frequency, and there it is. Not a voice, not music, but a whisper, soft sliding consonants, breath without language, not animal, not mechanical, not human. He plays it on loop for hours, hypnotized trying to identify the source, but there is none. When he triangulates the data, the signal doesn't converge. It diverges. From every angle, he analyzes the source moves. It shifts like a mirage, unpinnable, almost like it's responding to the very act of observation. He publishes his findings online. The post is live for 72 hours. Then it disappears. Not taken down, erased, scrubbed clean from archives and caches. The engineer never posts again, but others find it. The whisper line starts showing up in sonar logs from unrelated dives, cut into corners of recordings bent by interference. In every case, it's low near 15 hertz, far below most detection thresholds. But someone is listening, and the signal grows stronger. You see it in a 2021 NOAA analysis, flagged under unexplained vocal patterns. They ran speech recognition software across the raw feed as a joke. The results came back unsettling, not words, but syntax, pauses, repetitions, emphasis, a structure that mimics conversation, but with no second speaker, as if the whisper line is a monologue, or worse, a lure. One technician began to hallucinate after prolonged exposure. He claimed he could feel the signal breathing through the headphones, said it was like being spoken to from inside your own throat. He was hospitalized with audio-induced seizures. The cause, a rare form of neural resonance. The whisper line matched his brain's natural resting frequency. You find patterns in old logs. In the 1980s, naval subs occasionally recorded water ghosting, a name they gave to sonar loops that mimicked their own pings, back at them with slight alterations. Those pings, when slowed and mapped, form phonetic approximations of human language, a primitive copy, and then the signal went silent for years, until now. It resurfaces in 2023, this time embedded in fiber optic cable noise. The South Pacific Interlink Network experiences transient data pulses, not corruption, but perfectly timed null packets, empty data, but arranged in patterns resembling Morse code. One cluster spells sleep, another, not yet. That's when they realize the whisper line isn't passive. It's learning every sonar ping, every ship's log, every voice command from a submersible. It listens, it adapts, it reflects. One experimental ROV was programmed to respond to it. They set a loop ping every time the signal rose above 14 hertz. On the 12th ping, the signal replied, with a ping of its own, not an echo, a distinct tone, and embedded in that tone, a compressed audio file, a whisper. Slowed to human range, it sounds like, "You are close." Then nothing. The drone shut down. The team recovered the unit 3 days later, drifting upside down. Hull intact. Lights cold. But the memory log was overwritten with a single image. A shape sketched crudely in sonar static. A spiral, familiar. You remember the glyphs, the signal loops, the feeling of being watched in absolute dark. The whisper line isn't just a signal. It's a thread, a tether tied to something deeper than understanding, deeper than depth. A hand reaching up, not to pull you in, to feel if you're ready. And as it tests the limits of your voice, your machines, your understanding, it grows. Louder, clearer. It begins appearing in controlled experiments, mimicking voices from within sealed labs. It mimics laughter next. Not well, too dry, too slow, but getting better. You speak with a linguist who specializes in language development in isolation. She tells you something chilling. The whisper line is developing prosody tone rhythm pause. That's pre-language mimicry. It's not random, it's imitation. Which means it's heard enough of us to start playing us back. You ask what that means. She hesitates, then says, "We're not teaching it. We're triggering it. Something's waking up." You ask what happens next. She doesn't answer, but her assistant does. Maybe we've been echoing it all along. You think of all the times you've heard strange noises in deep-sea recordings, the ones labeled as unexplained, probably geological likely machinery. What if none of it was random? What if all those pings and knocks and hums were words long before we had the ears to understand? The whisper line isn't speech, it's response. And maybe we've already said too much. Maybe it's just waiting for the rest of the message. And when it hears it, it will whisper something back, louder, sharper, with purpose, because the sea does not forget. It listens. And now, through our cables, our sonar, our breathless curiosity, it finally has a voice. And it sounds like us. You've reached the end of the map, not the seafloor that stretches on deeper than your mind can grasp, layered in pressure and darkness and silence. No, this is the end of our map. The edge of what we're willing to draw, the point where certainty dissolves, and all you're left with are guesses, suspicions, and things you're not sure you were supposed to find. You come back to the whispers, the glows, the folds in space, the doors that weren't there until you saw them, the voices that aren't yours but sound like home, the heat pulses, the eyes, the spiral. Every story you've heard was scattered, disconnected. But now they begin to align, not perfectly, not like a machine, but like roots twisting through soil. You realize they're not separate events. They're symptoms of something vast, not necessarily alive, but not dead either. Something that doesn't move through space like we do, but instead lets space move through it. You remember the phrase from the deep sea diver who stared too long into the trench. It folds inward. What folds? You think maybe it's the ocean itself, or time, or your understanding of how things should work. You start seeing the ocean as something else, not a place, not a biome, but a medium, a fabric stretched over the mouth of something bigger. And lately, that fabric is starting to ripple. You revisit every anomaly, the synchronized lights under Tonga, the bioluminescent circles that align with sonar breaths, the pulse that mimics language but isn't language yet, the trenches that hide the drones that return blank, the currents that flow upward, the tone that shut off the most advanced sub on Earth with a single whisper. Each one leaves behind something, a trail, a feeling, and that feeling is anticipation, like something old and enormous has just shifted in its sleep. Not stirred in anger, not yet aware, but no longer dormant. You check seismic records again. Something stands out, dozens of microquakes at impossible depths beyond where tectonic activity normally occurs. Not with pressure, but with motion. Tiny tremors, hundreds of miles apart, but timed. 12 seconds apart, the same interval as the clockwork bell. You line the data up, and suddenly you're not looking at quakes. You're looking at a heartbeat. Slow, measured, still waking up. You think of lungs, of breath, of warmth leaking into the cold. And you remember what the old NOAA analyst said when reviewing a sonar anomaly file from the Peru Trench. This isn't a creature. This is a system. But systems don't wake up unless they were put to sleep, and you're no longer sure we were meant to find it. Maybe the door was never supposed to open. Maybe the spiral on the trench floor is a lock, not an invitation. Maybe every ping we send down there isn't a message, it's a key. You wonder how many we've turned already, how many times we've knocked, and what waits behind it. A god, an echo, a machine that counts time in millennia and dreams in frequencies. You don't know, and maybe you don't want to, because the signals are growing clearer. The heat waves more frequent. The strange mimicry more accurate. Something has started practicing. It doesn't move toward the surface. Not yet, but it's reaching. Curling tendrils of thought and resonance and biology upward, not claws, not teeth, just presence, a subtle press against the edges of reality. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. The sea already remembers it. And now so do you. The final log from a recent research mission, redacted but leaked in part, describes a dream shared by every crew member after drifting through the Peru Basin. In it, they were underwater, walking, not swimming, the floor